Chapter 1 of The Man in Lower Ten. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne, January 1st, 2010. The Man in Lower Ten by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 1. I Go to Pittsburgh. McKnight is gradually taking over the criminal end of the business. I never liked it, and since the strange case of the Man in Lower Ten, I have been a bit squeamish. Given a case like that, where you can build up a network of clues that absolutely incriminate three entirely different people, only one of whom can be guilty, and your faith in circumstantial evidence dies of overcrowding. I never see a shivering, white-faced wretch in the prisoner's dock that I do not hark back with shuddering horror to the strange events on the Pullman car Ontario, between Washington and Pittsburgh, on the night of September 9th last. McKnight could tell the story a great deal better than I, although he cannot spell 3 consecutive words correctly. But while he has imagination and humor, he is lazy. "It didn't happen to me anyhow," he protested when I put it up to him. "And nobody cares for second-hand thrills. Besides, you want the unvarnished and ungarnished truth, and I'm no hand for that. I'm a lawyer." So am I, although there have been times when my assumption in that particular has been disputed. I am unmarried and just old enough to dance with the grown-up little sisters of the girls I used to know. I am fond of outdoors, prefer horses to the aforesaid grown-up little sisters, am without sentiment. Note: am crossed out and was substituted. Editor. End of note. And completely ruled and frequently routed by my housekeeper, an elderly widow. In fact, of all the men of my acquaintance, I was probably the most prosaic, the least adventurous, the one man in 100 who would be likely to go without a deviation from the normal through the orderly procession of the seasons, summer suits to winter flannels, golf to bridge. So it was a queer freak of the demons of chance to perch on my unsusceptible 30-year-old chest, tie me up with a crime, ticket me with a love affair, and start me on that sensational and not always respectable journey that ended so surprisingly less than 3 weeks later in the firm's private office. It had been the most remarkable period of my life. I would neither give it up nor live it again under any inducement. And yet, all that I lost was some 20 yards off my drive. It was really McKnight's turn to make the next journey. I had a tournament at Chevy Chase for Saturday, and a short yacht cruise planned for Sunday, and when a man has been grinding at statute law for a week, he needs relaxation. But McKnight begged off. It was not the first time he had shirked that summer in order to run down to Richmond, and I was surly about it. But this time he had a new excuse. "I wouldn't be able to look after the business if I did go," he said. He had a sort of wide-eyed frankness that makes one ashamed to doubt him. "I'm always car-sick crossing the mountains. It's a fact, Lolly. Seesawing over the peaks does it. Why, crossing the Allegheny Mountains has the Gulf Stream to Bermuda beaten to a frazzle." So I gave him up finally and went home to pack. He came later in the evening with his machine, the Cannonball, to take me to the station, and he brought the forged notes in the Bronson case. "Guard them with your life," he warned me. "They are more precious than honor. Sew them in your chest protector, or wherever people keep valuables. I never keep any. I'll not be happy until I see Gentleman Andy doing the lockstep." He sat down on my clean collars, found my cigarettes, and struck a match on the mahogany bedpost with one movement. "Where's the pirate?" he demanded. The pirate is my housekeeper, Mrs. Clopton, a very worthy woman, so labelled and libelled because of a ferocious pair of eyes and what McKnight calls a buccaneering nose. I quietly closed the door to the hall. "Keep your voice down, Richie," I said. "She is looking for the evening paper to see if it is going to rain. She has my raincoat and umbrella waiting in the hall." The collars being damaged beyond repair, he left them and went to the window. He stood there for some time, staring at the blackness that represented the wall of the house next door. "It's raining now," he said over his shoulder, and closed the window and the shutters. Something in his voice made me glance up, but he was watching me, his hands idly in his pockets. "Who lives next door?" he inquired in a perfunctory tone. after a pause. I was packing my razor. "House is empty," I returned absently. "If the landlord would put it in some sort of shape—" "Did you put those notes in your pocket?" he broke in. "Yes," I was impatient, "along with my certificates of registration, baptism and vaccination. Whoever wants them will have to steal my coat to get them." "Well, I would move them if I were you. Somebody in the next house was confoundedly anxious to see where you put them. Somebody right at that window opposite." I scoffed at the idea, but nevertheless I moved the papers, putting them in my travelling bag, well down at the bottom. McKnight watched me uneasily. "I have a hunch that you are going to have trouble," he said, as I locked the alligator bag. "Darned if I like starting anything important on Friday." "You have a congenital dislike to start anything on any old day," I retorted, still sore from my lost Saturday. "And if you knew the owner of that house as I do, you would know that if there was anyone at that window he is paying rent for the privilege." Mrs. Clopton rapped at the door and spoke discreetly from the hall. "Did Mr. McKnight bring the evening paper?" she inquired. "Sorry, but I didn't, Mrs. Clopton," McKnight called. "The Cubs won, 3-0. He listened, grinning as she moved away with little irritated rustles of her black silk gown. I finished my packing, changed my collar and was ready to go. Then very cautiously we put out the light and opened the shutters. The window across was merely a deeper black in the darkness. It was closed and dirty, and yet, probably owing to Ritchie's suggestion, I had an uneasy sensation of eyes staring across at me. The next moment we were at the door, poised for flight. "We'll have to run for it," I said in a whisper. "She's down there with a package of some sort, sandwiches probably, and she's threatened me with overshoes for a month. Ready now." I had a kaleidoscope view of Mrs. Clopton in the lower hall, holding out an armful of such travelling impedimenta as she deemed essential, while beside her, Euphemia, the coloured housemaid, was grinning over a white-wrapped box. "Awful sorry. No time. Back Sunday," I panted over my shoulder. Then the door closed and the car was moving away. McKnight bent forward and stared at the facade of the empty house next door as we passed. It was black, staring, mysterious, as empty buildings are apt to be. "I'd like to hold a post-mortem on that corpse of a house," he said thoughtfully. "By George, I've a notion to get out and take a look." "Somebody after the brass pipes," I scoffed. "House has been empty for a year." With one hand on the steering wheel, McKnight held out the other for my cigarette case. "Perhaps," he said, "but I don't see what she would want with brass pipe." "A woman?" I laughed outright. "You have been looking too hard at the picture in the back of your watch, that's all. There's an experiment like that. If you stare long enough—" But McKnight was growing sulky. He sat looking rigidly ahead, and he did not speak again until he brought the Cannon Ball to a stop at the station. Even then it was only a perfunctory remark. He went through the gate with me, and with 5 minutes to spare, we lounged and smoked in the train shed. My mind had slid away from my surroundings and had wandered to a polo pony that I couldn't afford and intended to buy anyhow. Then McKnight shook off his taciturnity. "For heaven's sake, don't look so martyred," he burst out. "I know you've done all the travelling this summer. I know you're missing a game tomorrow. But don't be a patient mother. Confound it, I have to go to Richmond on Sunday. I want to see a girl." "Oh, don't mind me," I observed politely. "Personally, I wouldn't change places with you. What's her name? North? South?" "West," he snapped. "Don't try to be funny. And all I have to say, Blakely, is that if you ever fall in love I hope you make an egregious ass of yourself." In view of what followed, this came rather close to prophecy. The trip west was without incident. I played bridge with a furniture dealer from Grand Rapids, a sales agent for a Pittsburgh iron firm, and a young professor from an Eastern college. I won 3 rubbers out of 4, finished what cigarettes McKnight had left me, and went to bed about 1 o'clock. It was growing cooler, and the rain had ceased. Once, toward morning, I wakened with a start, for no apparent reason, and sat bolt upright. I had an uneasy feeling that someone had been looking at me, the same sensation I had experienced earlier in the evening at the window. But I could feel the bag with the notes between me and the window, and with my arm thrown over it for security, I lapsed again into slumber. Later, when I tried to piece together the fragments of that journey, I remembered that my coat, which had been folded and placed beyond my restless tossing, had been rescued in the morning from a heterogeneous jumble of blankets, evening papers, and cravat, had been shaken out with profanity and donned with wrath. At the time, nothing occurred to me but the necessity of writing to the Pullman Company and asking them if they ever travelled in their own cars. I even formulated some of the letter. "If they are built to scale, why not take a man of ordinary stature as your unit?" I wrote mentally. "I cannot fold together like the travelling cup with which I drink your abominable water." I was more cheerful after I had had a cup of coffee in the Union Station. It was too early to attend to business, and I lounged in the restaurant and hid behind the morning papers. As I had expected, they had got hold of my visit and its object. On the first page was a staring announcement that the forged papers in the Bronson case had been brought to Pittsburgh. Underneath, a telegram from Washington stated that Lawrence Blakely, of Blakely and McKnight, had left for Pittsburgh the night before, and that, owing to the approaching trial of the Bronson case and the illness of John Gilmore, the Pittsburgh millionaire, who was the chief witness for the prosecution, it was supposed that the visit was intimately concerned with the trial. I looked around apprehensively. There were no reporters yet in sight, and thankful to have escaped notice, I paid for my breakfast and left. At the cab stand I chose the least dilapidated hansom I could find, and giving the driver the address of the Gilmore residence in the East End, I got in. I was just in time. As the cab turned and rolled off, a slim young man in a straw hat separated himself from a little group of men and hurried toward us. "Hey, wait a minute there!" he called, breaking into a trot. But the cabby did not hear, or perhaps did not care to. We jogged comfortably along, to my relief, leaving the young man far behind. I avoid reporters on principle, having learned long ago that I am an easy mark for a clever interviewer. It was perhaps 9 o'clock when I left the station. Our way was along the boulevard which hugged the side of one of the city's great hills. Far below, to the left, lay the railroad tracks and the 70x7 looming stacks of the mills. The white mist of the river, the greys and blacks of the smoke blended into a half-revealing haze, dotted here and there with fire. It was unlovely, tremendous. Whistler might have painted it with its pathos, its majesty, but he would have missed what made it infinitely suggestive. The rattle and roar of iron on iron, the rumble of wheels, the throbbing beat, against the ears, of fire and heat and brawn, welding prosperity. Something of this I voiced to the grim old millionaire who was responsible for at least part of it. He was propped up in his bed in his East End home, listening to the market reports read by a nurse, and he smiled a little at my enthusiasm. "I can't see much beauty in it myself," he said, "but it's our badge of prosperity. The full dinner pail here means a nose that looks like a flue. Pittsburgh without smoke wouldn't be Pittsburgh, any more than New York prohibition would be New York. Sit down for a few minutes, Mr. Blakely. Now, Miss Gardner, Westinghouse Electric." The nurse resumed her reading in a monotonous voice. She read literally and without understanding, using initials and abbreviations as they came. But the shrewd old man followed her easily. Once, however, he stopped her. "D.O. is ditto," he said gently, "not do." As the nurse droned along, I found myself looking curiously at a photograph in a silver frame on the bedside table. It was the picture of a girl in white, with her hands clasped loosely before her. Against the dark background her figure stood out slim and young. Perhaps it was the rather grim environment. Possibly it was my mood. But although as a general thing photographs of young girls make no appeal to me, this one did. I found my eyes straying back to it. By a little finesse, I even made out the name written across the corner. Allison. Mr. Gilmore lay back among his pillows and listened to the nurse's listless voice. But he was watching me from under his heavy eyebrows, for when the reading was over and we were alone, he indicated the picture with a gesture. "I keep it there to remind myself that I am an old man," he said. "That is my granddaughter, Allison West." I expressed the customary polite surprise, at which, finding me responsive, he told me his age with a chuckle of pride. More surprise, this time genuine. From that we went to what he ate for breakfast and did not eat for luncheon, and then to his reserve power, which at 65 becomes a matter for thought. And so, in a wide circle, back to where we started, the picture. "Father was a rascal," John Gilmore said, picking up the frame. "The happiest day of my life was when I knew he was safely dead in bed and not hanged. If the child had looked like him, well, she doesn't. She's a Gilmore every inch. Supposed to look like me." "Very noticeably," I agreed soberly. I had produced the notes by that time, and replacing the picture Mr. Gilmore gathered his spectacles from beside it. He went over the 4 notes methodically, examining each carefully and putting it down before he picked up the next. Then he leaned back and took off his glasses. "They're not so bad," he said thoughtfully. "Not so bad. But I never saw them before. That's my unofficial signature. I'm inclined to think," he was speaking partly to himself, "to think that he has got hold of a letter of mine, probably to Alison. Bronson was a friend of her rascalian of a father." I took Mr. Gilmore's deposition and put it into my travelling bag with the forged notes. When I saw them again, almost 3 weeks later, they were unrecognizable, a mass of charred paper on a copper ash tray. In the interval, other and bigger things happened. The Bronson forgery case had shrunk beside the greater and more imminent mystery of the man in Lower 10, and Alison West had come into the story and into my life. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 2. A Torn Telegram. I lunched alone at the Gilmore house and went back to the city at once. The sun had lifted the mists, and a fresh summer wind had cleared away the smoke pall. The boulevard was full of cars flying countryward for the Saturday half-holiday, toward golf and tennis, green fields and babbling girls. I gritted my teeth and thought of McKnight at Richmond, visiting the lady with the geographical name. And then, for the first time, I associated John Gilmore's granddaughter with the West that McKnight had irritably flung at me. I still carried my travelling bag, for McKnight's vision at the window of the empty house had not been without effect. I did not transfer the notes to my pocket and, if I had, it would not have altered the situation later. Only the other day McKnight put this very thing up to me. "I warned you," he reminded me. "I told you there were queer things coming, and to be on your guard. You ought to have taken your revolver." "It would have been of exactly as much use as a bucket of snow in Africa," I retorted. If I had never closed my eyes, or if I had kept my finger on the trigger of a 6-shooter, which is novelesque for revolver, the result would have been the same. And the next time you want a little excitement with every variety of thrill thrown in, I can put you by way of it. You begin by getting the wrong berth in a Pullman car and end... "Oh, I know how it ends," he finished shortly. "Don't you suppose the whole thing's written on my spinal marrow?" But I am wandering again. That is the difficulty with the unprofessional storyteller. He yaws back and forth and can't keep in the wind. He drops his characters overboard when he hasn't any further use for them and drowns them. He forgets the coffee pot and the frying pan and all the other small essentials, and if he carries a love affair, he mutters a fervent "Allah be praised" when he lands them, drenched with adventures, at the matrimonial dock at the end of the final chapter. I put in a thoroughly unsatisfactory afternoon. Time dragged eternally. I dropped in at a summer vaudeville and bought some ties at a haberdasher's. I was bored but unexpectant. I had no premonition of what was to come. Nothing unusual had ever happened to me. Friends of mine had sometimes sailed the high seas of adventure or skirted the coasts of chance. But all of the shipwrecks had occurred after a woman passenger had been taken on. Ergo, I had always said, no women. I repeated it to myself that evening almost savagely, when I found my thoughts straying back to the picture of John Gilmore's granddaughter. I even argued as I ate my solitary dinner at a downtown restaurant. Haven't you troubles enough, I reflected, without looking for more? Hasn't bad news gone lame with a matinee race booked for the next week? Otherwise, aren't you comfortable? Isn't your house in order? Do you want to sell a pony in order to have the library done over in mission or the drawing room in gold? Do you want somebody to count the empty cigarette boxes lying around every morning? Lay it to the long idle afternoon, to the new environment, to anything you like, but I began to think that perhaps I did. I was confoundedly lonely. For the first time in my life its even course began to waver. The needle registered warning marks on the matrimonial seismograph, lines vague enough, but lines. My alligator bag lay at my feet, still locked. While I waited for my coffee I leaned back and surveyed the people incuriously. There were the usual couples intent on each other. My new state of mind made me regard them with tolerance. But at the next table, where a man and woman dined together, a different atmosphere prevailed. My attention was first caught by the woman's face. She had been speaking earnestly across the table, her profile turned to me. I had noticed casually her earnest manner, her sombre clothes, and the great mass of odd, bronze-colored hair on her neck. But suddenly she glanced toward me, and the utter hopelessness, almost tragedy, of her expression struck me with a shock. She half closed her eyes and drew a long breath, and then she turned again to the man across the table. Neither one was eating. He sat low in his chair, his chin on his chest, ugly folds of thick flesh protruding over his collar. He was probably 50, bald, grotesque, sullen, and yet not without a suggestion of power. But he had been drinking. As I looked, he raised an unsteady hand and summoned a waiter with a wine list. The young woman bent across the table and spoke again quickly. She had unconsciously raised her voice. Not beautiful, in her earnestness and stress, she rather interested me. I had an idle inclination to advise the waiter to remove the bottled temptation from the table. I wonder what would have happened if I had. Suppose Harrington had not been intoxicated when he entered the Pullman car Ontario that night? For they were about to make a journey, I gathered, and the young woman wished to go alone. I drank 3 cups of coffee, which accounted for my wakefulness later, and shamelessly watched the tableau before me. The woman's protest evidently went for nothing. Across the table the man grunted monosyllabic replies and grew more and more lowering and sullen. Once, during a brief unexpected pianissimo in the music, her voice came to me sharply. "If I could only see him in time," she was saying. "Oh, it's terrible!" In spite of my interest, I would have forgotten the whole incident at once, erased it from my mind as one does the inessentials and clutterings of memory, had I not met them again, later that evening, in the Pennsylvania station. The situation between them had not visibly altered. The same dogged determination showed in the man's face. But the young woman, daughter or wife, I wondered, had drawn down her veil, and I could only suspect what white misery lay beneath. I bought my berth after waiting in a line of some 8 or 10 people. When, step by step, I had almost reached the window, a tall woman whom I had not noticed before spoke to me from my elbow. She had a ticket and money in her hand. "Will you try to get me a lower when you buy yours?" she asked. "I have travelled for 3 nights in uppers." I consented, of course. Beyond that I hardly noticed the woman. I had a vague impression of height and a certain amount of stateliness, but the crowd was pushing behind me, and someone was standing on my foot. I got 2 lowers easily, and, turning with change and burrs, held out the tickets. "Which will you have?" I asked. "Lower 11 or lower 10?" "It makes no difference," she said. "Thank you very much indeed." At random I gave her lower 11 and called a porter to help her with her luggage. I followed them leisurely to the train shed, and 10 minutes more saw us under way. I looked into my car, but it presented the peculiarly unattractive appearance common to sleepers. The burrs were made up, the centre aisle was a path between walls of dingy, breeze-repelling curtains, while the 2 seats at each end of the car were piled high with suitcases and umbrellas. The perspiring porter was trying to be 6 places at once. Somebody had said that Pullman porters are black so they won't show the dirt, but they certainly show the heat. 9:15 was an outrageous hour to go to bed, especially since I sleep little or not at all on the train. So I made my way to the smoker and passed the time until nearly 11 with cigarettes and a magazine. The car was very close. It was a warm night, and before turning in I stood a short time in the vestibule. The train had been stopping at frequent intervals, and, finding the brakeman there, I asked the trouble. It seemed that there was a hot box on the next car, and that not only were we late, but we were delaying the second section just behind. I was beginning to feel pleasantly drowsy, and the air was growing cooler as we got into the mountains. I said good night to the brakeman and went back to my berth. To my surprise, lower 10 was already occupied. A suitcase projected from beneath and a pair of shoes stood on the floor, and from behind the curtains came the heavy, unmistakable breathing of deep sleep. I hunted out the porter and together we investigated. "Are you asleep, sir?" asked the porter, leaning over deferentially. No answer forthcoming, he opened the curtains and looked in. Yes, the intruder was asleep, very much asleep, and an overwhelming odor of whiskey proclaimed that he would probably remain asleep until morning. I was irritated. The car was full, and I was not disposed to take an upper in order to allow this drunken interloper to sleep comfortably in my berth. "You'll have to get out of this," I said, shaking him angrily. But he merely grunted and turned over. As he did so, I saw his features for the first time. It was the quarrelsome man of the restaurant. I was less disposed than ever to relinquish my claim, but the porter, after a little quiet investigation, offered a solution of the difficulty. "There's no one in lower 9, he suggested, pulling open the curtains just across. "It's likely 9's his berth, and he's made a mistake owing to his condition. You'd better take 9, sir." I did, with a firm resolution that if 9's rightful owner turned up later I should be just as unwakeable as the man opposite. I undressed leisurely, making sure of the safety of the forged notes, and placing my grip, as before, between myself and the window. Being a man of systematic habits, I arranged my clothes carefully, putting my shoes out for the porter to polish, and stowing my collar and scarf in the little hammock swung for the purpose. At last, with my pillows so arranged that I could see out comfortably, and with the unhygienic-looking blanket turned back (I have always a distrust of these much-used affairs), I prepared to wait gradually for sleep. But sleep did not visit me. The train came to frequent grating stops, and I surmised the hot box again. I am not a nervous man, but there was something chilling in the thought of the second section pounding along behind us. Once, as I was dozing, our locomotive whistled a shrill warning. "You keep back where you belong," it screamed to my drowsy ears. And from somewhere behind came a chastened, "All right, I will." I grew more and more wide awake. At Cresson I got up on my elbow and blinked out at the station lights. Some passengers boarded the train there, and I heard a woman's low tones, a southern voice, rich and full, then quiet again. Every nerve was tense. Time passed, perhaps 10 minutes, possibly half an hour. Then, without the slightest warning, as the train rounded a curve, a heavy body was thrown into my berth. The incident, trivial as it seemed, was startling in its suddenness, for although my ears were painfully strained and awake, I had heard no step outside. The next instant the curtain hung limp again, still without a sound. My disturber had slipped away into the gloom and darkness. In a frenzy of wakefulness I sat up, drew on a pair of slippers and fumbled for my bathrobe. From a berth across, probably lower 10, came that particularly aggravating snore which begins lightly, delicately, faintly soprano, goes down the scale a note with every breath, and after keeping the listener tense with expectation, ends with an explosion that tears the very air. I was more and more irritable. I sat on the edge of the berth and hoped the snorer would choke to death. He had considerable vitality, however. He withstood one shock after another and survived to start over again with new vigor. In desperation I found some cigarettes and one match, piled my blankets over my grip, and drawing the curtains together as though the berth were still occupied, I made my way to the vestibule of the car. I was not clad for dress parade. Is it because the male is so restricted to gloom in his everyday attire that he blossoms into gaudy colors in his pajamas and dressing gowns? It would take a Turk to feel at home before an audience in my red and yellow bathrobe, a Christmas remembrance from Mrs. Clopton, with slippers to match. So, naturally, when I saw a feminine figure on the platform, my first instinct was to dodge. The woman, however, was quicker than I. She gave me a startled glance, wheeled and disappeared, with a flash of 2 bronze-colored braids, into the next car. Cigarette box in one hand, match in the other, I leaned against the uncertain frame of the door and gazed after her vanishing figure. The mountain air flapped my bathrobe around my bare ankles. My one match burned to the end and went out, and still I stared. For I had seen on her expressive face a haunting look that was horror, nothing less. Heaven knows I am not psychological. Emotions have to be written large before I can read them. But a woman in trouble always appeals to me, and this woman was more than that. She was in deadly fear. If I had not been afraid of being ridiculous, I would have followed her. But I fancied that the apparition of a man in a red and yellow bathrobe, with an unkempt thatch of hair, walking up to her and assuring her that he would protect her would probably put her into hysterics. I had done that once before, when burglars had tried to break into the house, and had startled the parlour maid into bed for a week. So I tried to assure myself that I had imagined the lady's distress, or caused it, perhaps, and to dismiss her from my mind. Perhaps she was merely anxious about the unpleasant gentleman of the restaurant. I thought smugly that I could have told her all about him, that he was sleeping the sleep of the just and the intoxicated in a berth that ought, by all that was fair and right, to have been mine, and that if I were tied to a man who snored like that I should have him anesthetized and his soft palate put where it would never again flap like a loose sail in the wind. We passed Harrisburg as I stood there. It was starlight, and the great crests of the Alleghanies had given way to low hills. At intervals we passed smudges of grey-white, no doubt in daytime comfortable farms, which McKnight says is a good way of putting it, the farms being a lot more comfortable than the people on them. I was growing drowsy. The woman with the bronze hair and the horrified face was fading in retrospect. It was colder, too, and I turned with a shiver to go in. As I did so, a bit of paper fluttered into the air and settled on my sleeve, like a butterfly on a gorgeous red and yellow blossom. I picked it up curiously and glanced at it. It was part of a telegram that had been torn into bits. There were only parts of 4 words on the scrap, but it left me puzzled and thoughtful. It read, Lower 10, car 7. Lower 10, car 7 was my berth, the one I had bought and found preempted. End of chapter 2. Chapters 3 and 4 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 3. Across the Aisle. No solution offering itself, I went back to my berth. The snorer across had apparently strangled or turned over, and so after a time I dropped asleep, to be awakened by the morning sunlight across my face. I felt for my watch, yawning prodigiously. I reached under the pillow and failed to find it, but something scratched the back of my hand. I sat up irritably and nursed the wound, which was bleeding a little. Still drowsy, I felt more cautiously for what I supposed had been my scarf pin, but there was nothing there. Wide awake now, I reached for my travelling bag, on the chance that I had put my watch in there. I had drawn the satchel to me, and had my hand on the lock before I realized that it was not my own. Mine was of alligator hide. I had killed the beast in Florida, after the expenditure of enough money to have bought a house and enough energy to have built one. The bag I held in my hand was a black one, sealskin, I think. The staggering thought of what the loss of my bag meant to me put my finger on the bell and kept it there until the porter came. "Did you ring, sir?" he asked, poking his head through the curtains obsequiously. McKnight objects that nobody can poke his head through a curtain and be obsequious, but Pullman porters can and do. "No," I snapped. "It rang itself. What in thunder do you mean by exchanging my valise for this one? You'll have to find it if you waken the entire car to do it. There are important papers in that grip." "Porter," called a feminine voice from an upper berth near by. "Porter, am I to dangle here all day?" "Let her dangle," I said savagely. "You find that bag of mine." The porter frowned. Then he looked at me with injured dignity. "I brought in your overcoat, sir. You carried your own valise." The fellow was right. In an excess of caution I had refused to relinquish my alligator bag, and had turned over my other traps to the porter. It was clear enough then. I was simply a victim of the usual sleeping car robbery. I was in a lather of perspiration by that time. The lady down the car was still dangling and talking about it. Still nearer, a feminine voice was giving quick orders in French, presumably to a maid. The porter was on his knees, looking under the berth. "Not there, sir," he said, dusting his knees. He was visibly more cheerful, having been absolved of responsibility. "Reckon it was taken while you was wanderin' around the car last night." "I'll give you $50 if you find it," I said. "100. Reach up my shoes and I'll—" I stopped abruptly. My eyes were fixed in stupefied amazement on a coat that hung from a hook at the foot of my berth. From the coat they travelled, dazed, to the soft bosomed shirt beside it, and from there to the collar and cravat in the net hammock across the windows. "100," the porter repeated, showing his teeth; but I caught him by the arm and pointed to the foot of the berth. "What colour is that coat?" I asked unsteadily. "Grey, sir." His tone was one of gentle reproof. "And the trousers?" He reached over and held up one creased leg. "Grey, too," he grinned. Grey! I could not believe even his corroboration of my own eyes. But my clothes were blue! The porter was amused. He dived under the curtains and brought up a pair of shoes. "Your shoes, sir," he said with a flourish. "Reckon you've been dreamin', sir." Now, there are two things I always avoid in my dress, possibly an idiosyncrasy of my bachelor existence. These taboo articles are red neckties and tan shoes. And not only were the shoes the porter lifted from the floor of a gorgeous shade of yellow, but the scarf which was run through the turned over collar was a gaudy red. It took a full minute for the real import of things to penetrate my dazed intelligence. Then I gave a vindictive kick at the offending ensemble. "They're not mine, any of them," I snarled. "They are some other fellow's. I'll sit here until I take root before I put them on." "They're nice looking clothes," the porter put in, eyeing the red necktie with appreciation. "Ain't everybody would have left you anything." "Call the conductor," I said shortly. Then a possible explanation occurred to me. "Oh, porter, what's the number of this berth?" "7, sir. If you can't wear those shoes—" 7! In my relief I almost shouted it. "Why then, it's simple enough. I'm in the wrong berth, that's all. My berth is 9. Only, where the deuce is the man who belongs here?" "Likely in 9, sir." The darky was enjoying himself. "You and the other gentleman just got mixed in the night, that's all, sir." It was clear that he thought I had been drinking. I drew a long breath. Of course that was the explanation. This was number 7's berth. That was his soft hat. This his umbrella, his coat, his bag. My rage turned to irritation at myself. The porter went to the next berth and I could hear his softly insinuating voice. "Time to get up, sir. Are you awake? Time to get up." There was no response from number 9. I guessed that he had opened the curtains and was looking in. Then he came back. "Number 9's empty," he said. "Empty? Do you mean my clothes aren't there?" I demanded. "My valise? Why don't you answer me?" "You don't give me time," he retorted. "There ain't nothing there, but it's been slept in." The disappointment was the greater for my few moments of hope. I sat up in a white fury and put on the clothes that had been left me. Then, still raging, I sat on the edge of the berth and put on the obnoxious tan shoes. The porter, called to his duties, made little excursions back to me, to offer assistance and to chuckle at my discomfiture. He stood by, outwardly decorous, but with little irritating grins of amusement around his mouth, when I finally emerged with the red tie in my hand. "Bet the owner of those clothes didn't become them any more than you do," he said as he plied the ubiquitous whisk broom. "When I get the owner of these clothes," I retorted grimly, "he will need a shroud. Where's the conductor?" The conductor was coming, he assured me. Also that there was no bag answering the description of mine on the car. I slammed my way to the dressing room, washed, choked my 15½ neck into a 15 collar, and was back again in less than 5 minutes. The car, as well as its occupants, was gradually taking on a daylight appearance. I hobbled in, for one of the shoes was abominably tight, and found myself facing a young woman in blue, with an unforgettable face. 3 women already, McKnight says. That's going some, even if you don't count the Gilmore nurse. She stood half turned toward me, one hand idly drooping, the other steadying her as she gazed out at the flying landscape. I had an instant impression that I had met her somewhere, under different circumstances, more cheerful ones, I thought, for the girl's dejection now was evident. Beside her, sitting down, a small dark woman, considerably older, was talking in a rapid undertone. The girl nodded indifferently now and then. I fancied, although I was not sure, that my appearance brought a startled look to the young woman's face. I sat down and, hands thrust deep into the other man's pockets, stared ruefully at the other man's shoes. The stage was set. In a moment the curtain was going up on the first act of the play, and for a while we would all say our little speeches and sing our little songs, and I, the villain, would hold centre stage while the gallery hissed. The porter was standing beside lower 10. He had reached in and was knocking valiantly, but his efforts met with no response. He winked at me over his shoulder. Then he unfastened the curtains and bent forward. Behind him, I saw him stiffen, heard his muttered exclamation, saw the bluish pallor that spread over his face and neck. As he retreated a step the interior of lower 10 lay open to the day. The man in it was on his back, the early morning sun striking full on his upturned face. But the light did not disturb him. A small stain of red dyed the front of his night clothes and trailed across the sheet. His half-opened eyes were fixed, without seeing, on the shining wood above. I grasped the porter's shaking shoulders and stared down to where the train imparted to the body a grisly suggestion of motion. "Good Lord!" I gasped. "The man's been murdered!" Chapter 4. Numbers 7 and 9. Afterwards, when I tried to recall our discovery of the body in lower 10, I found that my most vivid impression was not that made by the revelation of the opened curtain. I had an instantaneous picture of a slender, blue-gowned girl who seemed to sense my words rather than hear them, of two small hands that clutched desperately at the seat beside them. The girl in the aisle stood, bent toward us, perplexity and alarm fighting in her face. With twitching hands the porter attempted to draw the curtains together. Then, in a paralysis of shock, he collapsed on the edge of my berth and sat there swaying. In my excitement I shook him. "For heaven's sake, keep your nerve, man," I said brusquely. "You'll have every woman in the car in hysterics. And if you do, you'll wish you could change places with that man in there." He rolled his eyes. A man near, who had been reading last night's paper, dropped it quickly and tiptoed toward us. He peered between the partly opened curtains, closed them quietly and went back, ostentatiously solemn, to his seat. The very crackle with which he opened his paper added to the bursting curiosity of the car. For the passengers knew that something was amiss. I was conscious of a sudden tension. With the curtains closed, the porter was more himself. He wiped his lips with a handkerchief and stood erect. "It's my last trip in this car," he remarked heavily. "There's something wrong with that berth. Last trip the woman in it took an overdose of some sleeping stuff, and we found her, just like that, dead. And it ain't more'n 3 months now since there was twins born in that very spot. No, sir, it ain't natural." At that moment a thin man with prominent eyes and a spare, grayish goatee creaked up the aisle and paused beside me. "Porter sick?" he inquired, taking in with a professional eye the porter's horror-struck face, my own excitement, and the slightly gaping curtains of lower 10. He reached for the darkey's pulse and pulled out an old-fashioned gold watch. Only 50. What's the matter? Had a shock?" he asked shrewdly. "Yes," I answered for the porter. "We've both had one. If you are a doctor, I wish you would look at the man in the berth across, lower 10. I'm afraid it's too late, but I'm not experienced in such matters." Together we opened the curtains, and the doctor, bending down, gave a comprehensive glance that took in the rolling head, the relaxed jaw, the ugly stain on the sheet. The examination needed only a moment. Death was written in the clear white of the nostrils, the colorless lips, the smoothing away of the sinister lines of the night before. With its new dignity the face was not unhandsome. The gray hair was still plentiful, the features strong and well cut. The doctor straightened himself and turned to me. "Dead for some time," he said, running a professional finger over the stains. These are dry and darkened, you see, and rigor mortis is well established. A friend of yours?" "I don't know him at all," I replied. "Never saw him but once before." "Then you don't know if he is travelling alone?" "No, he was not. That is, I don't know anything about him," I corrected myself. It was my first blunder. The doctor glanced up at me quickly and then turned his attention again to the body. Like a flash there had come to me the vision of the woman with the bronze hair and the tragic face, whom I had surprised in the vestibule between the cars, somewhere in the small hours of the morning. I had acted on my first impulse, the masculine one of shielding a woman. The doctor had unfastened the coat of the striped pyjamas and exposed the dead man's chest. On the left side was a small punctured wound of insignificant size. "Very neatly done," the doctor said with appreciation. "Couldn't have done it better myself. Right through the intercostal space. No time even to grunt." "Isn't the heart around there somewhere?" I asked. The medical man turned toward me and smiled austerely. "That's where it belongs, just under the puncture, when it isn't gadding about in a man's throat or his boots." I had a new respect for the doctor, for anyone indeed who could crack even a feeble joke under such circumstances, or who could run an impersonal finger over that wound and those stains. Odd how a healthy, normal man holds the medical profession in half contemptuous regard until he gets sick, or an emergency like this arises, and then turns meekly to the man who knows the ins and outs of his mortal tenement, takes his pills or his patronage, ties to him like a rudderless ship in a gale. "Suicide, is it, doctor?" I asked. He stood erect, after drawing the bed clothing over the face and taking off his glasses. He wiped them slowly. "No, it is not suicide," he announced decisively. "It is murder." Of course, I had expected that, but the word itself brought a shiver. I was just a bit dizzy. Curious faces through the car were turning toward us, and I could hear the porter behind me breathing audibly. A stout woman in negligee came down the aisle and querulously confronted the porter. She wore a pink dressing jacket and carried portions of her clothing. "Porter," she began, in the voice of the lady who had dangled, "is there a rule of this company that will allow a woman to occupy the dressing room for 1 hour and curl her hair with an alcohol lamp while respectable people haven't a place where they can hook their—" She stopped suddenly and stared into lower 10. Her shining pink cheeks grew pasty. Her jaw fell. I remembered trying to think of something to say and of saying nothing at all. Then she had buried her eyes in the nondescript garments that hung from her arm and tottered back the way she had come. Slowly a little knot of men gathered around us, silent for the most part. The doctor was making a search of the berth when the conductor elbowed his way through, followed by the inquisitive man, who had evidently summoned him. I had lost sight, for a time, of the girl in blue. "Do it himself?" the conductor queried, after a businesslike glance at the body. "No, he didn't," the doctor asserted. "There's no weapon here and the window is closed. He couldn't have thrown it out and he didn't swallow it. What on earth are you looking for, man?" Someone was on the floor at our feet, face down, head peering under the berth. Now he got up without apology, revealing the man who had summoned the conductor. He was dusty, alert, cheerful, and he dragged up with him the dead man's suitcase. The sight of it brought back to me at once my own predicament. "I don't know whether there's any connection or not, conductor," I said, "but I'm a victim too, in less degree. I've been robbed of everything I possess except a red and yellow bathrobe. I happened to be wearing the bathrobe, which was probably the reason the thief overlooked it." There was a fresh murmur in the crowd. Somebody laughed nervously. The conductor was irritated. "I can't bother with that now," he snarled. "The railroad company is responsible for transportation, not for clothes, jewelry and morals. If people want to be stabbed and robbed in the company's cars, it's their affair. Why didn't you sleep in your clothes? I do." I took an angry step forward. Then somebody touched my arm and I unclenched my fist. I could understand the conductor's position, and beside, in the law, I had been guilty myself of contributory negligence. "I'm not trying to make you responsible," I protested, as amiably as I could. "And I believe the clothes the thief left are as good as my own. They are certainly newer. But my valise contained valuable papers, and it is to your interest as well as mine to find the man who stole it." "Why, of course," the doctor said shrewdly. "Find the man who skipped out with this gentleman's clothes and you've probably got the murderer. I went to bed in lower 9, I said, my mind full again of my lost papers, and I wakened in number 7. I was up in the night prowling around, as I was unable to sleep, and I must have gone back to the wrong berth. Anyhow, until the porter wakened me this morning, I knew nothing of my mistake. In the interval the thief, murderer too, perhaps, must have come back, discovered my error, and taken advantage of it to further his escape. The inquisitive man looked at me from between narrowed eyelids, ferret-like. "Did any one on the train suspect you of having valuable papers?" he inquired. The crowd was listening intently. "No one," I answered promptly and positively. The doctor was investigating the murdered man's effects. The pockets of his trousers contained the usual miscellany of keys and small change, while in his hip pocket was found a small pearl-handled revolver of the type women usually keep around. A gold watch with a Masonic charm had slid down between the mattress and the window, while a showy diamond stud was still fastened in the bosom of his shirt. Taken as a whole, the personal belongings were those of a man of some means, but without any particular degree of breeding. The doctor heaped them together. Either robbery was not the motive, he reflected, or the thief overlooked these things in his hurry. The latter hypothesis seemed the more tenable when, after a thorough search, we found no pocketbook and less than $1 in small change. The suitcase gave no clue. It contained one empty leather-coloured flask and a pint bottle, also empty, a change of linen, and some collars with the laundry mark S.H. In the leather tag on the handle was a card with the name Simon Harrington, Pittsburgh. The conductor sat down on my unmade berth across and made an entry of the name and address. Then, on an old envelope, he wrote a few words and gave it to the porter, who disappeared. "I guess that's all I can do," he said. "I've had enough trouble this trip to last for a year. They don't need a conductor on these trains any more. What they ought to have is a sheriff and a posse." The porter from the next car came in and whispered to him. The conductor rose unhappily. "Next car's caught the disease," he grumbled. "Doctor, a woman back there has got mumps or bubonic plague or something. Will you come back?" The strange porter stood aside. "Lady about the middle of the car," he said. "In black, sir, with queer-looking hair, sort of copper color, I think, sir." End of chapter 4. Chapters 5 and 6 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Next Car. With the departure of the conductor and the doctor, the group around Lower 10 broke up, to re-form in smaller knots through the car. The porter remained on guard. With something of relief I sank into a seat. I wanted to think, to try to remember the details of the previous night. But my inquisitive acquaintance had other intentions. He came up and sat down beside me. Like the conductor, he had taken notes of the dead man's belongings, his name, address, clothing, and general circumstances of the crime. Now, with his little notebook open before him, he prepared to enjoy the minor sensation of the robbery. "And now for the second victim," he began cheerfully. "What is your name and address, please?" I eyed him with suspicion. "I have lost everything but my name and address," I parried. "What do you want them for? Publication?" "Oh, no, dear no," he said, shocked at my misapprehension. "Merely for my own enlightenment. I like to gather data of this kind and draw my own conclusions. Most interesting and engrossing. Once or twice I have forestalled the results of police investigation, but entirely for my own amusement." I nodded tolerantly. Most of us have hobbies. I knew a man once who carried his handkerchief up his sleeve and had a mania for old coloured prints cut out of Goody's Lady's Book. I used that inductive method originated by Poe and followed since with such great success by Conan Doyle. Have you ever read Gaboriau? Ah, you have missed a treat indeed. And now, to get down to business, what is the name of our escaped thief and probable murderer? "How on earth do I know?" I demanded impatiently. "He didn't write it in blood anywhere, did he?" The little man looked hurt and disappointed. "Do you mean to say," he asked, "that the pockets of those clothes are entirely empty?" The pockets! In the excitement I had forgotten entirely the sealskin grip which the porter now sat at my feet, and I had not investigated the pockets at all. With the inquisitive man's pencil taking note of everything that I found, I emptied them on the opposite seat. Upper left-hand waistcoat, 2 lead pencils and a fountain pen. Lower right waistcoat, matchbox and a small stamp book. Right-hand pocket coat, pair of grey suede gloves, new, size 7½ Left-hand pocket, gunmetal cigarette case studded with pearls, half full of Egyptian cigarettes. The trouser pockets contained a gold penknife, a small amount of money in bills and change, and a handkerchief with the initial S on it. Further search through the coat discovered a card case with cards bearing the name Henry Pickney Sullivan, and a leather flask with gold mountings, filled with what seemed to be very fair whisky, and monogrammed H.P.S. "His name, evidently, is Henry Pickney Sullivan," said the cheerful follower of Poe, as he wrote it down. "Address yet unknown. Blonde, probably. Have you noticed that it is almost always the blonde men who affect a very light grey, with a touch of red in the scarf? Fact, I assure you. I kept a record once of the summer attire of men, and 90% followed my rule. Dark men like you affect navy, blue or brown." In spite of myself I was amused at the man's shrewdness. "Yes, the suit he took was dark, a blue," I said. He rubbed his hands and smiled at me delightedly. "Then you wore black shoes, not tan," he said, with a glance at the aggressively yellow ones I wore. "Right again," I acknowledged. "Black low shoes and black embroidered hose. If you keep on you'll have a motive for the crime and the murder's present place of hiding. And if you come back to the smoker with me, I'll give you an opportunity to judge if he knew good whiskey from bad." I put the articles from the pockets back again and got up. "I wonder if there is a diner on," I said. "I need something sustaining after all this." I was conscious then of someone at my elbow. I turned to see the young woman whose face was so vaguely familiar. In the very act of speaking she drew back suddenly and coloured. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said hurriedly. "I thought you were someone else." She was looking in a puzzled fashion at my coat. I felt all the cringing guilt of a man who has accidentally picked up the wrong umbrella. My borrowed collar sat tight on my neck. "I'm sorry," I said idiotically. "I'm sorry, but I'm not." I have learned since that she has bright brown hair, with a loose wave in it that drops over her ears, and dark blue eyes with black lashes, and... But what does it matter? One enjoys a picture as a whole, not as the sum of its parts. She saw the flask then, and her errand came back to her. "One of the ladies at the end of the car has fainted," she explained. "I thought perhaps a stimulant." I picked up the flask at once and followed my guide down the aisle. 2 or 3 women were working over the woman who had fainted. They had opened her collar and taken out her hairpins, whatever good that might do. The stout woman was vigorously rubbing her wrists, with the idea, no doubt, of working up her pulse. The unconscious woman was the one for whom I had secured lower 11 at the station. I poured a little liqueur in a bungling masculine fashion between her lips as she leaned back with closed eyes. She choked, coughed, and rallied somewhat. "Poor thing," said the stout lady. "As she lies back that way I could almost think it was my mother. She used to faint so much." "It would make anybody faint," chimed in another. "Murder and robbery in one night, and on one car. I'm thankful I always wear my rings in a bag around my neck, even if they do get under me and keep me awake." The girl in blue was looking at us with wide, startled eyes. I saw her pale a little, saw the quick, apprehensive glance which she threw at her travelling companion, the small woman I had noticed before. There was an exchange, almost a clash, of glances. The small woman frowned, that was all. I turned my attention again to my patient. She had revived somewhat, and now she asked to have the window open. The train had stopped again and the car was oppressively hot. People around were looking at their watches and grumbling over the delay. The doctor bustled in with a remark about its being his busy day. The amateur detective and the porter together mounted guard over lower 10. Outside the heat rose in shimmering waves from the tracks. The very wood of the car was hot to touch. A Camberwell beauty darted through the open door and made its way, in erratic plunges, great wings waving, down the sunny aisle. All around lay the peace of harvested fields, the quiet of the country. Chapter 6. The Girl in Blue. I was growing more and more irritable. The thought of what the loss of the notes meant was fast crowding the murder to the back of my mind. The forced inaction was intolerable. The porter had reported no bag answering the description of mine on the train, but I was disposed to make my own investigation. I made a tour of the cars, scrutinizing every variety of hand luggage, ranging from luxurious English bags with gold mountings to the wicker nondescripts of the day coach at the rear. I was not alone in my quest, for the girl in blue was just ahead of me. Car by car she preceded me through the train, unconscious that I was behind her, looking at each passenger as she passed. I fancied the proceeding was distasteful, but that she had determined on a course and was carrying it through. We reached the end of the train almost together, empty-handed both of us. The girl went out to the platform. When she saw me she moved aside, and I stepped out beside her. Behind us the track curved sharply. The early sunshine threw the train in long black shadow over the hot earth. Forward somewhere they were hammering. The girl said nothing, but her profile was strained and anxious. If you have lost anything," I began, "I wish you would let me try to help. Not that my own success is anything to boast of." She hardly glanced at me. It was not flattering. "I have not been robbed, if that is what you mean," she replied quietly. "I am perplexed, that is all." There was nothing to say to that. I lifted my hat, the other fellow's hat, and turned to go back to my car. 2 or 3 members of the train crew, including the conductor, were standing in the shadow talking, and at that moment from a farmhouse near came the swift clang of the breakfast bell, calling in the hands from barn and pasture. I turned back to the girl. "We may be here for an hour," I said, "and there is no buffet car on. If I remember my youth, that bell means ham and eggs and country butter and coffee. If you care to run the risk—" "I am not hungry," she said, "but perhaps a cup of coffee. Dear me, I believe I am hungry," she finished. "Only—" she glanced back of her. "I can bring your companion," I suggested without enthusiasm. But the young woman shook her head. "She is not hungry," she objected, "and she is very—well, I know she wouldn't come. Do you suppose we could make it if we run?" "I haven't any idea," I said cheerfully. "Any old train would be better than this one, if it does leave us behind." "Yes, any train would be better than this one," she repeated gravely. I found myself watching her changing expression. I had spoken 24 words to her, and already I felt that I knew the lights and shades in her voice. I, who had always known how a woman rode to hounds, and who never could have told the colour of her hair. I stepped down on the ties and turned to assist her, and together we walked back to where the conductor and the porter from our car were in close conversation. Instinctively my hand went to my cigarette pocket and came out empty. She saw the gesture. "If you want to smoke, you may," she said. "I have a big cousin who smokes all the time. He says I'm kippered." I drew out the gunmetal cigarette case and opened it. But this most commonplace action had an extraordinary result. The girl beside me stopped dead still and stood staring at it with fascinated eyes. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, with a catch in her voice, her gaze still fixed on the cigarette case. "Then you haven't heard the rest of the tragedy?" I asked, holding out the case. "It's frightfully bad luck for me, but it makes a good story. You see—" At that moment the conductor and porter ceased their colloquy. The conductor came directly toward me, tugging as he came at his bristling grey moustache. "I would like to talk to you in the car," he said to me, with a curious glance at the young lady. "Can't it wait?" I objected. "We are on our way to a cup of coffee and a slice of bacon. Be merciful, as you are powerful." "I'm afraid the breakfast will have to wait," he replied. "I won't keep you long." There was a note of authority in his voice which I resented. But, after all, the circumstances were unusual. "We'll have to defer that cup of coffee for a while," I said to the girl. "But don't despair. There's breakfast somewhere." As we entered the car she stood aside, but I felt rather than saw that she followed us. I was surprised to see 6 men gathered around the berth in which I had wakened number 7. It had not yet been made up. As we passed along the aisle, I was conscious of a new expression on the faces of the passengers. The tall woman who had fainted was searching my face with narrowed eyes, while the stout woman of the kindly heart avoided my gaze and pretended to look out the window. As we pushed our way through the group, I fancied that it closed around me ominously. The conductor said nothing, but led the way without ceremony to the side of the berth. "What's the matter?" I inquired. I was puzzled, but not apprehensive. "Have you some of my things? I'd be thankful even for my shoes. These are confoundedly tight." Nobody spoke, and I fell silent too. For one of the pillows had been turned over, and the underside of the white case was streaked with brownish stains. I think it was a perceptible time before I realized that the stains were blood, and that the faces around were filled with suspicion and distrust. "Why, that looks like blood," I said vacuously. There was an incessant pounding in my ears, and the conductor's voice came from far off. "It is blood," he asserted grimly. I looked around with a dizzy attempt at nonchalance. "Even if it is," I remonstrated, "surely don't suppose for a moment that I know anything about it." The amateur detective elbowed his way in. He had a scrap of transparent paper in his hand and a pencil. "I would like permission to trace the stains," he began eagerly. "Also, to me, if you will kindly jab your finger with a pin, needle, anything." "If you don't keep out of this," the conductor said savagely, "I will do some jabbing myself. As for you, sir," he turned to me. I was absolutely innocent, but I knew that I presented a typical picture of guilt. I was covered with cold sweat, and the pounding in my ears kept up dizzily. "As for you, sir." The irrepressible amateur detective made a quick pounce at the pillow and pushed back the cover. Before our incredulous eyes he drew out a narrow steel dirk which had been buried to the small cross that served as a head. There was a chorus of voices around, a quick surging forward of the crowd. So that was what had scratched my hand. I buried the wound in my coat pocket. "Well," I said, trying to speak naturally, "doesn't that prove what I have been telling you? The man who committed the murder belonged to this berth and made an exchange in some way after the crime. How do you know he didn't change the tag so I would come back to this berth?" This was an inspiration. I was pleased with it. "That's what he did. He changed the tags," I reiterated. There was a murmur of assent around. The doctor, who was standing beside me, put his hand on my arm. "If this gentleman committed this crime, and I for one feel sure he did not, then who is the fellow who got away, and why did he go?" "We have only one man's word for that," the conductor snarled. "I've travelled some in these cars myself, and no one ever changed burrs with me." Somebody on the edge of the group asserted that hereafter he would travel by daylight. I glanced up and caught the eye of the girl in blue. "They are all mad," she said. Her tone was low, but I heard her distinctly. "Don't take them seriously enough to defend yourself." "I'm glad you think I didn't do it," I observed meekly, over the crowd. "Nothing else is of any importance." The conductor had pulled out his notebook again. "Your name, please," he said gruffly. "Lawrence Blakely, Washington." "Your occupation?" "Attorney. A member of the firm of Blakely and McKnight." "Mr. Blakely, you say you have occupied the wrong berth and have been robbed. Do you know anything of the man who did it?" "Only from what he left behind," I answered. "These clothes." "They fit you," he said with quick suspicion. "Isn't that rather a coincidence? You are a large man." "Good heavens!" I retorted, stung into fury. "Do I look like a man who would wear this kind of necktie? Do you suppose I carry purple and green barred silk handkerchiefs? Would any man in his senses wear a pair of shoes a full size too small?" The conductor was inclined to hedge. "You will have to grant that I am in a peculiar position," he said. "I have only your word as to the exchange of burrs, and you understand I am merely doing my duty. Are there any clues in the pockets?" For the second time I emptied them of their contents, which he noted. "Is that all?" he finished. "There was nothing else?" "Nothing." "That's not all, sir," broke in the porter, stepping forward. "There was a small black satchel." "That's so," I exclaimed. "I forgot the bag. I don't even know where it is." The easily swayed crowd looked suspicious again. I've grown so accustomed to reading the faces of a jury seeing them swing from doubt to belief and back again to doubt, that I instinctively watch expressions. I saw that my forgetfulness had done me harm, that suspicion was roused again. The bag was found a couple of seats away, under somebody's raincoat, another dubious circumstance. Was I hiding it? It was brought to the berth and placed beside the conductor, who opened it at once. It contained the usual travelling impedimenta: change of linen, collars, handkerchiefs, a bronze green scarf, and a safety razor. But the attention of the crowd riveted itself on a flat Russian leather wallet, around which a heavy gum band was wrapped, and which bore in gilt letters the name Simon Harrington. Chapter 7 and 8 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 7. A Fine Gold Chain. The conductor held it out to me, his face sternly accusing. "Is this another coincidence?" he asked. "Did the man who left you his clothes, and the barred silk handkerchief, and the tight shoes, leave you the spoil of the murder?" The men standing around had drawn off a little, and I saw the absolute futility of any remonstrance. Have you ever seen a fly who, in these hygienic days, finding no cobwebs to entangle him, is caught in a sheet of fly paper, finds himself more and more mired, and is finally quiet with the sticky stillness of despair? Well, I was the fly. I had seen too much of circumstantial evidence to have any belief that the establishing of my identity would weigh much against the other incriminating details. It meant imprisonment and trial, probably, with all the notoriety and loss of practice they would entail. A man thinks quickly at a time like that. All the probable consequences of the finding of that pocket-book flashed through my mind as I extended my hand to take it. Then I drew my arm back. "I don't want it," I said. "Look inside. Maybe the other man took the money and left the wallet." The conductor opened it, and again there was a curious surging forward of the crowd. To my intense disappointment, the money was still there. I stood blankly miserable while it was counted out: 5 $100 bills, 6 20s, and some 5s and 1s that brought the total to $650. The little man with the notebook insisted on taking the numbers of the notes, to the conductor's annoyance. It was immaterial to me. Small things had lost their power to irritate. I was seeing myself in the prisoner's box, going through all the nerve-racking routine of a trial for murder. The challenging of the jury, the endless cross-examinations, the alternate hope and fear. I believe I said before that I had no nerves, but for a few minutes that morning I was as near as a man ever comes to hysteria. I folded my arms and gave myself a mental shake. I seemed to be the centre of 100 eyes, expressing every shade of doubt and distrust, but I tried not to flinch. Then someone created a diversion. The amateur detective was busy again with the sealskin bag, investigating the make of the safety razor and the manufacturer's name on the bronze green tie. Now, however, he paused and frowned, as though some pet theory had been upset. Then, from a corner of the bag he drew out and held up for our inspection some 3 inches of fine gold chain, one end of which was blackened and stained with blood. The conductor held out his hand for it, but the little man was not ready to give it up. He turned to me. "You say no watch was left you. Was there a piece of chain like that?" "No chain at all," I replied sulkily. "No jewellery of any kind, except plain gold buttons in the shirt I am wearing." "Where are your glasses?" he threw at me suddenly. Instinctively my hand went to my eyes. My glasses had been gone all morning, and I had not even noticed their absence. The little man smiled cynically and held out the chain. "I must ask you to examine this," he insisted. "Isn't it a part of the fine gold chain you wear over your ear?" I didn't want to touch the thing. The stain at the end made me shudder. But with a baker's dozen of suspicious eyes, well, we'll say 14, there were no one-eyed men. I took the fragment in the tips of my fingers and looked at it helplessly. "Very fine chains are much alike," I managed to say. "For all I know, this may be mine, but I don't know how it got into that sealskin bag. I never saw the bag until this morning after daylight." "He admits that he had the bag," somebody said behind me. "How did you guess that he wore glasses, anyhow?" to the amateur sleuth. That gentleman cleared his throat. "There were two reasons," he said, "for suspecting it. When you see a man with the lines of his face drooping, a healthy individual with a pensive eye, suspect astigmatism. Besides, this gentleman has a pronounced line across the bridge of his nose and a mark on his ear from the chain." After this remarkable exhibition of the theoretical as combined with the practical, he sank into a seat near by, and, still holding the chain, sat with closed eyes and pursed lips. It was evident to all the car that the solution of the mystery was a question of moments. Once he bent forward eagerly, and putting the chain on the window sill, proceeded to go over it with a pocket magnifying glass, only to shake his head in disappointment. All the people around shook their heads too, although they had not the slightest idea what it was about. The pounding in my ears began again. The group around me seemed to be suddenly motionless, in the very act of moving, as if a hypnotist had called "rigid." The girl in blue was looking at me, and above the din I thought she said she must speak to me, something vital. The pounding grew louder, and merged into a scream. With a grinding and splintering the car rose under my feet. Then it fell away into darkness. Chapter 8. The Second Section. Have you ever been picked up out of your 3 meals-a-day life, whirled around in a tornado of events, and landed in a situation so grotesque and yet so horrible that you laugh even while you are groaning and straining at its hopelessness? McKnight says that is hysteria, and that no man worthy of the name ever admits to it. Also, as McKnight says, it sounds like a tank drama. Just as the revolving saw is about to cut the hero into stove lengths, the second villain blows up the sawmill. The hero goes up through the roof and alights on the bank of a stream at the feet of his lady-love, who is making daisy chains. Nevertheless, when I was safely home again, with Mrs. Clopton brewing strange drinks that came in paper packets from the pharmacy and that smelled to heaven, I remember staggering to the door and closing it, and then going back to bed and howling with the absurdity and the madness of the whole thing. And while I laughed my very soul was sick, for the girl was gone by that time, and I knew by all the loyalty that answers between men for honour that I would have to put her out of my mind. And yet, all the night that followed, filled as it was with the shrieking demons of pain, I saw her as I had seen her last, in the queer hat with green ribbons. I told the doctor this, guardedly, the next morning, and he said it was the morphia, and that I was lucky not to have seen a row of devils with green tails. I don't know anything about the wreck of September 9th last. You who swallowed the details with your coffee and digested the horrors with your chop probably know a great deal more than I do. I remember very distinctly that the jumping and throbbing in my arm brought me back to a world that at first was nothing but sky, a heap of clouds that I thought hazily were the meringue on a blue charlotte russe. As the sense of hearing was slowly added to vision, I heard a woman near me sobbing that she had lost her hat-pin and she couldn't keep her hat on. I think I dropped into unconsciousness again, for the next thing I remember was of my blue patch of sky clouded with smoke, of a strange roaring and crackling, of a rain of fiery sparks on my face, and of somebody beating at me with feeble hands. I opened my eyes and closed them again. The girl in blue was bending over me. With that imperviousness to big things and keenness to small that is the first effect of shock, I tried to be facetious, when a spark stung my cheek. "You will have to rouse yourself," the girl was repeating desperately. "You've been on fire twice already." A piece of striped ticking floated slowly over my head. As the wind caught it, its charring edges leaped into flame. "Looks like a kite, doesn't it?" I remarked cheerfully. And then, as my arm gave an excruciating throb, "Jove, how my arm hurts!" The girl bent over and spoke slowly, distinctly, as one might speak to a deaf person or a child. "Listen, Mr. Blakely," she said earnestly. "You must rouse yourself. There has been a terrible accident. The second section ran into us. The wreck is burning now, and if we don't move, we will catch fire. Do you hear?" Her voice and my arm were bringing me to my senses. "I hear," I said. I'll sit up in a second. Are you hurt?" "No, only bruised. Do you think you can walk?" I drew up one foot after another, gingerly. "They seem to move all right," I remarked dubiously. "Would you mind telling me where the back of my head has gone? I can't help thinking it isn't there." She made a quick examination. "It's pretty badly bumped," she said. "You must have fallen on it." I had got up on my uninjured elbow by that time, but the pain threw me back. "Don't look at the wreck," I entreated her. "It's no sight for a woman. If there's any way to tie up this arm, I might be able to do something. There may be people under those cars." "Then it is too late to help," she replied solemnly. A little shower of feathers, each carrying its fiery lamp, blew over us from some burning pillow. A part of the wreck collapsed with a crash. In a resolute endeavour to play a man's part in the tragedy going on all around, I got to my knees. Then I realized what I had not noticed before. The hand and wrist of the broken left arm were jammed through the handle of the sealskin grip. I gasped and sat down suddenly. "You must not do that," the girl insisted. I noticed now that she kept her back to the wreck, her eyes averted. "The weight of the travelling bag must be agony. Let me support the valise until we get back a few yards. Then you must lie down until we can get it cut off." "Will it have to be cut off?" I asked as calmly as possible. There were red-hot stabs of agony clear to my neck, but we were moving slowly away from the track. "Yes," she replied, with dumbfounding coolness. "If I had a knife, I could do it myself. You might sit here and lean against this fence." By that time my returning faculties had realized that she was going to cut off the satchel, not the arm. The dizziness was leaving and I was gradually becoming myself. "If you pull it, it might come," I suggested. "And with that weight gone, I think I will cease to be 5 foot 11 inches of baby." She tried gently to loosen the handle, but it would not move, and at last, with great drops of cold perspiration over me, I had to give up. "I'm afraid I can't stand it," I said. "But there's a knife somewhere around these clothes, and if I can find it, perhaps you can cut the leather." As I gave her the knife, she turned it over, examining it with a peculiar expression, bewilderment rather than surprise, but she said nothing. She set to work deftly, and in a few minutes the bag dropped free. "That's better," I declared, sitting up. "Now, if you can pin my sleeve to my coat, it will support the arm so we can get away from here." "The pin might give," she objected, "and the jerk would be terrible." She looked around, puzzled. Then she got up, coming back in a minute with a draggled, partly scorched sheet. This she tore into a large square, and after she had folded it, she slipped it under the broken arm and tied it securely at the back of my neck. The relief was immediate, and picking up the sealskin bag, I walked slowly beside her, away from the track. The first act was over, the curtain fallen, the scene was struck. End of chapter 8. Chapters 9 and 10 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 9. The Halcyon Breakfast. We were still dazed, I think, for we wandered like two troubled children, our one idea at first, to get as far away as we could from the horror behind us. We were both bareheaded, grimy, pallid through the grit. Now and then we met little groups of country folk hurrying to the track. They stared at us curiously, and some wished to question us. But we hurried past them. We had put the wreck behind us. That way lay madness. Only once the girl turned and looked behind her. The wreck was hidden, but the smoke cloud hung heavy and dense. For the first time I remembered that my companion had not been alone on the train. "It is quiet here," I suggested. "If you will sit down on the bank, I will go back and make some inquiries. I've been criminally thoughtless. Your travelling companion." She interrupted me, and something of her splendid poise was gone. "Please don't go back," she said. I am afraid it would be of no use, and I don't want to be left alone." Heaven knows I did not want her to be alone. I was more than content to walk along beside her aimlessly for any length of time. Gradually, as she lost the exaltation of the moment, I was gaining my normal condition of mind. I was beginning to realize that I had lacked the morning grace of a shave, that I looked like some lost hope of yesterday, and that my left shoe pinched outrageously. A man does not rise triumphant above such handicaps. The girl, for all her disordered hair and the crumpled linen of her waist, in spite of her missing hat and the small gold bag that hung forlornly from a broken chain, looked exceedingly lovely. "That I won't leave you alone," I said manfully, and we stumbled on together. Thus far we had seen nobody from the wreck, but well up the lane we came across the tall dark woman who had occupied lower 11. She was half crouching beside the road, her black hair about her shoulders, an ugly bruise over her eye. She did not seem to know us, and refused to accompany us. We left her there at last, babbling incoherently and rolling in her hands a dozen pebbles she had gathered in the road. The girl shuddered as we went on. Once she turned and glanced at my bandage. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked. "It's growing rather numb, but it might be worse," I answered mendaciously. If anything in the world could be worse, I had never experienced it. And so we trudged on bareheaded under the summer sun, growing parched and dusty and weary, doggedly leaving behind us the pillar of smoke. I thought I knew of a trolley line somewhere in the direction we were going, or perhaps we could find a horse and trap to take us into Baltimore. The girl smiled when I suggested it. "We will create a sensation, won't we?" she asked. "Isn't it queer? Or perhaps it's my state of mind. But I keep wishing for a pair of gloves, when I haven't even a hat." When we reached the main road we sat down for a moment, and her hair, which had been coming loose for some time, fell over her shoulders in little waves that were most alluring. It seemed a pity to twist it up again, but when I suggested this, cautiously, she said it was troublesome and got in her eyes when it was loose. So she gathered it up, while I held a row of little shell combs and pins, and when it was done it was vastly becoming too. Funny about hair. A man never knows he has it until he begins to lose it. But it's different with a girl. Something of the unconventional situation began to dawn on her as she put in the last hairpin and patted some stray locks to place. "I have not told you my name," she said abruptly. "I forgot that because I know who you are. You know nothing about me. I am Alison West, and my home is in Richmond." So that was it. This was the girl of the photograph on John Gilmore's bedside table. The girl McKnight expected to see in Richmond the next day, Sunday. She was on her way back to meet him. Well, what difference did it make anyhow? We had been thrown together by the merest chance. In an hour or two at the most, we would be back in civilization, and she would recall me, if she remembered me at all, as an unshaven creature in a red cravat and tan shoes, with a soiled Pullman sheet tied round my neck. I drew a deep breath. "Just a twinge," I said, when she glanced up quickly. "It's very good of you to let me know, Miss West. I have been hearing delightful things about you for 3 months." "From Richie McKnight?" She was frankly curious. "Yes, from Richie McKnight," I assented. Was it any wonder McKnight was crazy about her? I dug my heels into the dust. "I have been visiting near Cresson, in the mountains," Miss West was saying. "The person you mentioned, Mrs. Curtis, was my hostess. We were on our way to Washington together." She spoke slowly, as if she wished to give the minimum explanation. Across her face had come again the baffling expression of perplexity and trouble I had seen before. "You were on your way home, I suppose? Richie spoke about seeing you." I floundered, finding it necessary to say something. She looked at me with level, direct eyes. "No," she returned quietly. "I did not intend to go home. Well, it doesn't matter. I am going home now." A woman in a calico dress with 2 children, each an exact duplicate of the other, had come quickly down the road. She took in the situation at a glance and was explosively hospitable. "You poor things," she said. "If you'll take the first road to the left over there, and turn in at the second pigsty, you will find breakfast on the table and a coffee pot on the stove, and there's plenty of soap and water too. Don't say one word. There isn't a soul there to see you." We accepted the invitation, and she hurried on toward the excitement of the railroad. I got up carefully and helped Miss West to her feet. "At the second pigsty to the left," I repeated, "we will find the breakfast I promised you 7 eternities ago. Forward to the pigsty!" We said very little for the remainder of that walk. I had almost reached the limits of endurance. With every step the broken ends of the bone grated together. We found the farmhouse without difficulty, and I remember wondering if I could hold out to the end of the old stone walk that led between hedges to the door. "Allah be praised!" I said with all the voice I could muster. "Behold the coffee pot!" And then I put down the grip and folded up like a jackknife on the porch floor. When I came around, something hot was trickling down my neck, and a despairing voice was saying, "Oh, I don't seem to be able to pour it into your mouth. Please open your eyes." "But I don't want it in my eyes," I replied dreamily. "I haven't any idea what came over me. It was the shoes, I think. The left one is a red-hot torture." I was sitting by that time and looking across into her face. Never before or since have I fainted, but I would do it joyfully, a dozen times a day, if I could waken again to the blissful touch of soft fingers on my face, the hot ecstasy of coffee spilled by those fingers down my neck. There was a thrill in every tone of her voice that morning. Before long my loyalty to McKnight would step between me and the girl he loved. Life would develop new complexities. In those early hours after the wreck, full of pain as they were, there was nothing of the suspicion and distrust that came later. Shorn of our gauds and baubles, we were primitive man and woman, together. Our world for the hour was the deserted farmhouse, the slope of wheat field that led to the road, the woodland lot, the pasture. We breakfasted together across the homey table. Our cheerfulness, at first sheer reaction, became less forced as we ate great slices of bread from the granny oven back of the house, and drank hot fluid that smelled like coffee and tasted like nothing that I have ever swallowed. We found cream in stone jars, sunk deep in the chill water of the spring house, and there were eggs, great yellow-brown ones, a basket of them. So, like two children awakened from a nightmare, we chattered over our food, we hunted mutual friends, we laughed together at my feeble witticisms, and we put the horror behind us resolutely. After all, it was the hat with the green ribbons that brought back the strangeness of the situation. All along I had the impression that Alison West was deliberately putting out of her mind something that obtruded now and then. It brought with it a return of the puzzled expression that I had surprised early in the day, before the wreck. I caught it once, when, breakfast over, she was tightening the sling that held the broken arm. I had prolonged the morning meal as much as I could, but when the wooden clock with the pink roses on the dial pointed to 10:30, and the mother with the duplicate youngsters had not come back, Miss West made the move I had dreaded. "If we are to get into Baltimore at all, we must start," she said, rising. "You ought to see a doctor as soon as possible." "Hush," I said warningly. "Don't mention the arm, please. It is asleep now. You may rouse it." "If I only had a hat," she reflected. "It wouldn't need to be much of one, but—" She gave a little cry and darted to the corner. "Look," she said triumphantly, "the very thing! With the green streamers tied up in a bow, like this. Do you suppose the child would mind? I can put $5 or so here. That would buy a dozen of them." It was a queer affair of straw, that hat, with a round crown and a rim that flopped dismally. With a single movement she had turned it up at one side and fitted it to her head. Grotesque by itself, when she wore it, it was a thing of joy. Evidently, the lack of head covering had troubled her, for she was elated at her find. She left me, scrawling a note of thanks and pinning it with a bill to the tablecloth, and ran upstairs to the mirror and the promised soap and water. I did not see her when she came down. I had discovered a bench with a tin basin outside the kitchen door, and was washing, in a helpless one-sided way. I felt, rather than saw, that she was standing in the doorway, and I made a final plunge into the basin. "How is it possible for a man with only a right hand to wash his left ear?" I asked from the roller towel. I was distinctly uncomfortable. Men are more rigorous creatures of convention than women, whether they admit it or not. There is so much soap on me still that if I laugh I will blow bubbles. Washing with rainwater and homemade soap is like motoring on a slippery road. I only struck the high places. Then, having achieved a brilliant polish with the towel, I looked at the girl. She was leaning against the frame of the door, her face perfectly colourless, her breath coming in slow, difficult respirations. The erratic hat was pinned in place, but it had slid rakishly to one side. When I realized that she was staring, not at me, but past me to the road along which we had come, I turned and followed her gaze. There was no one in sight. The lane stretched dust white in the sun. No moving figure on it. No sign of life. Chapter 10. Miss West's Request. The surprising change in her held me speechless. All the animation of the breakfast table was gone. There was no hint of the response with which, before, she had met my nonsensical sallies. She stood there, white-lipped, unsmiling, staring down the dusty road. One hand was clenched tight over some small object. Her eyes dropped to it from the distant road, and then closed, with a quick, indrawn breath. Her colour came back slowly. Whatever had caused the change, she said nothing. She was anxious to leave at once, almost impatient over my deliberate masculine way of getting my things together. Afterward I recalled that I had wanted to explore the barn for a horse and some sort of vehicle to take us to the trolley, and that she had refused to allow me to look. I remembered many things later that might have helped me, and did not. At the time, I was only completely bewildered. Save the wreck, the responsibility for which lay between Providence and the engineer of the second section, all the events of that strange morning were logically connected. They came from one cause, and tended unerringly to one end. But the cause was buried, the end not yet in view. Not until we had left the house well behind did the girl's face relax its tense lines. I was watching her more closely than I had realized, for when we had gone a little way along the road she turned to me almost petulantly. "Please don't stare so at me," she said, to my sudden confusion. "I know the hat is dreadful. Green always makes me look ghastly." "Perhaps it was the green." I was unaccountably relieved. "Do you know, a few minutes ago you looked almost pallid to me." She glanced at me quickly, but I was gazing ahead. We were out of sight of the house now, and with every step away from it the girl was obviously relieved. Whatever she held in her hand, she never glanced at it, but she was conscious of it every second. She seemed to come to a decision about it while we were still in sight of the gate, for she murmured something and turned back alone, going swiftly, her feet stirring up small puffs of dust at every step. She fastened something to the gate-post. I could see the nervous haste with which she worked. When she joined me again it was without explanation, but the clenched fingers were free now, and while she looked tired and worn, the strain had visibly relaxed. We walked along slowly in the general direction of the suburban trolley line. Once a man with an empty wagon offered us a lift, but after a glance at the springless vehicle, I declined. "The ends of the bone think they are castanets as it is," I explained, "but the young lady, however, declined, and we went on together. Once, when the trolley line was in sight, she got a pebble in her low shoe, and we sat down under a tree until she found the cause of the trouble. I don't know what I should have done without you," I blundered. "Moral support and all that. Do you know, my first conscious thought after the wreck was of relief that you had not been hurt?" She was sitting beside me, where a big chestnut tree shaded the road, and I surprised a look of misery on her face that certainly my words had not been meant to produce. "And my first thought," she said slowly, "was regret that I hadn't been obliterated, blown out like a candle. Please don't look at me like that. I am only talking." But her lips were trembling, and because the little shams of society are forgotten at times like this, I leaned over and patted her hand lightly where it rested on the grass beside me. "You must not say those things," I expostulated. "Perhaps, after all, your friends—" "I had no friends on the train." Her voice was hard again, her tone final. She drew her hand from under mine, not quickly, but decisively. A car was in sight, coming toward us. The steel finger of civilization, of propriety, of visiting cards and formal introductions was beckoning us in. Miss West put on her shoe. We said little on the car. The few passengers stared at us frankly and discussed the wreck, emphasizing its horrors. The girl did not seem to hear. Once she turned to me with the quick, unexpected movement that was one of her charms. "I do not wish my mother to know I was in the accident," she said. "Will you please not tell Ritchie about having met me?" I gave my promise, of course. Again, when we were almost into Baltimore, she asked to examine the gunmetal cigarette case, and sat silent with it in her hands, while I told of the early morning's events on the Ontario. "So you see," I finished, "this grip, everything I have on, belongs to a fellow named Sullivan. He probably left the train before the wreck, perhaps just after the murder." "And so you think he committed the crime?" Her eyes were on the cigarette case. "Naturally," I said. "A man doesn't jump off a Pullman car in the middle of the night in another man's clothes unless he's trying to get away from something. Besides the dirk, there were the stains that you saw. Why, I have the murdered man's pocketbook in this valise at my feet. What does that look like?" I coloured when I saw the ghost of a smile hovering about the corners of her mouth. "That is," I finished, "if you care to believe that I am innocent." The sustaining chain of her small gold bag gave way just then. She did not notice it. I picked it up and slid the trinket into my pocket, for safe keeping, where I promptly forgot it. Afterwards, I wished I had let it lie unnoticed on the floor of that dirty little suburban car; and even now, when I see a woman carelessly dangling a similar feminine trinket, I shudder involuntarily. There comes back to me the memory of a girl's puzzled eyes under the brim of a flopping hat, the haunting suspicion of the sleepless nights that followed. Just then, I was determined that my companion should not stray back to the wreck, and to that end I was determinedly fastidious. "Do you know that it is Sunday?" she asked suddenly, "and that we are actually ragged?" "Never mind that," I retorted. "All Baltimore is divided on Sunday into three parts: those who rise up and go to church, those who rise up and read the newspapers, and those who don't rise up. The first are somewhere between the creed and the sermon, and we need not worry about the others." "You treat me like a child," she said almost pettishly. "Don't try so hard to be cheerful. It is almost ghastly." After that I subsided like a pricked balloon, and the remainder of the ride was made in silence. The information that she would go to friends in the city was a shock. It meant an earlier separation than I had planned for. But my arm was beginning again. In putting her into the cab, I struck it and gritted my teeth with the pain. It was probably for that reason that I forgot the gold bag. She leaned forward and held out her hand. "I may not have another chance to thank you," she said, "and I think I would better not try, anyhow. I cannot tell you how grateful I am." I muttered something about the gratitude being mine. Owing to the knock, I was seeing two cabs, and two girls were holding out two hands. "Remember," they were both saying, "you have never met me, Mr. Blakely, and, if you ever hear anything about me that is not pleasant, I want you to think the best you can of me. Will you?" The two girls were one now, with little flashes of white light playing all around. I'm afraid that I shall think too well for my own good," I said unsteadily, and the cab drove on. Chapter 11 of The Man in Lower Ten. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower Ten by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 11. The name was Sullivan. I had my arm done up temporarily in Baltimore, and took the next train home. I was pretty far gone when I stumbled out of a cab almost into the scandalized arms of Mrs. Clopton. In 15 minutes I was in bed, with that good woman piling on blankets and blistering me in unprotected places with hot water bottles. And in an hour I had had a whiff of chloroform, and Dr. Williams had set the broken bone. I dropped asleep then, waking in the late twilight to a realization that I was at home again, without the papers that meant conviction for Andy Bronson, with a charge of murder hanging over my head, and with something more than an impression of the girl my best friend was in love with, a girl moreover who was almost as great an enigma as the crime itself. "And I'm no hand at guessing riddles," I groaned half aloud. Mrs. Clopton came over promptly and put a cold cloth on my forehead. "Euphemia," she said to someone outside the door, "telephone the doctor that he is still rambling, but that he has switched from green ribbons to riddles." "There's nothing the matter with me, Mrs. Clopton," I rebelled. I was only thinking out loud. Confound that cloth! It's trickling all over me." I gave it a fling, and heard it land with a soggy thud on the floor. "Thinking out loud is delirium," Mrs. Clopton said imperturbably. "A fresh cloth, Euphemia." This time she held it on with a firm pressure that I was too weak to resist. I expostulated feebly that I was drowning, which she also laid to my mental exaltation, and then I finally dropped into a damp sleep. It was probably midnight when I roused again. I had been dreaming of the wreck, and it was inexpressibly comforting to feel the stability of my bed and to realize the equal stability of Mrs. Clopton, who sat, fully attired, by the night-light, reading Science and Health. "Does that book say anything about opening the windows on a hot night?" I suggested when I had got my bearings. She put it down immediately and came over to me. If there is one time when Mrs. Clopton is chastened, and it is the only time, it is when she reads Science and Health. "I don't like to open the shutters, Mr. Lawrence," she explained. "Not since the night you were away." But pressed further, she refused to explain. "The doctor said you were not to be excited," she persisted. "Here's your beef tea." "Not a drop until you tell me," I said firmly. "Besides, you know very well there's nothing the matter with me. This arm of mine is only a false belief." I sat up gingerly. "Now, why don't you open that window?" Mrs. Clopton succumbed. "Because there are queer goings on in that house next door," she said. "If you will take the beef tea, Mr. Lawrence, I will tell you." The queer goings on, however, proved to be slightly disappointing. It seemed that after I left on Friday night a light was seen flitting fitfully through the empty house next door. Euphemia had seen it first and called Mrs. Clopton. Together they had watched it breathlessly until it disappeared on the lower floor. "You should have been a writer of ghost stories," I said, giving my pillows a thump. "And so it was flitting fitfully." "That's what it was doing," she reiterated. "Flitting fitfully. Flitting fitfully. How you do throw one out, Mr. Lawrence! And what's more, it came again." "Oh, come now, Mrs. Clopton," I objected. "Ghosts are like lightning. They never strike twice in the same night. That's only worth half a cup of beef tea." "You may ask Euphemia," she retorted with dignity. "Not more than an hour after, there was a light there again. We saw it through the chinks in the shutters. Only, this time it began at the lower floor and climbed." "You oughtn't to tell ghost stories at night," came McKnight's voice from the doorway. "Really, Mrs. Clopton, I'm amazed at you, you old duffer. I've got you to thank for the worst day of my life." Mrs. Clopton gulped. Then, realizing that old duffer was meant for me, she took her empty cup and went out muttering. "The pirate's crazy about me, isn't she?" McKnight said to the closing door. Then he swung round and held out his hand. "By Jove!" he said. "I've been laying you out all day. Lilies on the doorbell, black gloves, everything. If you had had the sense of a mosquito in a snowstorm, you would have telephoned me." I never even thought of it. I was filled with remorse. "Upon my word, Rich, I hadn't an idea beyond getting away from that place. If you had seen what I saw—" McKnight stopped me. "Seen it? Why, you lunatic, I've been digging for you all day in the ruins. I've lunched and dined on horrors. Give me something to rinse them down, Lolly." He had fished the keys of the cellaret from its hiding place in my shoe bag, and was mixing himself what he called a Bernard Shaw, a foundation of brandy and soda with a little of everything else in sight to give it snap. Now that I saw him clearly, he looked weary and grimy. I hated to tell him what I knew he was waiting to hear, but there was no use wading in by inches. I ducked and got it over. "The notes are gone, Rich," I said as quietly as I could. In spite of himself, his face fell. Of course I expected it," he said. "But Mrs. Clopton said over the telephone that you had brought home a grip, and I hoped—well, Lord knows we ought not to complain. You're here, damaged, but here." He lifted his glass. "Happy days, old man." "If you will give me that black bottle, and a teaspoon, I'll drink that in arnica, or whatever the stuff is. Rich, the notes were gone before the wreck." He wheeled and stared at me, the bottle in his hand. "Lost, strayed, or stolen?" he queried, with forced lightness. "Stolen, although I believe the theft was incidental to something else." Mrs. Clopton came in at that moment, with an eggnog in her hand. She glanced at the clock, and, without addressing anyone in particular, she intimated that it was time for self-respecting folks to be at home in bed. McKnight, who could never resist a fling at her back, spoke to me in a stage whisper. "Is she talking still, or again?" he asked, just before the door closed. There was a second's indecision with the knob. Then, judging discretion the better part, Mrs. Clopton went away. "Now then," McKnight said, settling himself in a chair beside the bed. "Spit it out. Not the wreck, I know all I want about that. But the theft. I can tell you beforehand that it was a woman." I had crawled painfully out of bed and was in the act of pouring the eggnog down the pipe of the washstand. I paused, with the glass in the air. "A woman?" I repeated, startled. "What makes you think that?" "You don't know the first principles of a good detective yarn," he said scornfully. "Of course, it was the woman in the empty house next door. You said it was brass pipes, you will remember. Well, on with the dance. Let joy be unconfined." So, I told the story. I had told it so many times that day that I did it automatically, and I told about the girl with the bronze hair and my suspicions, but I did not mention Alison West. McKnight listened to the end without interruption. When I had finished, he drew a long breath. "Well," he said, "that's something of a mess, isn't it? If you can only prove your mild and childlike disposition, they couldn't hold you for the murder, which is a regular 10, 20, 30 crime anyway. But the notes, that's different. They're not burned anyhow. Your man wasn't on the train, therefore he wasn't in the wreck. If he didn't know what he was taking, as you seem to think, he probably reads the papers, and unless he's a fathead, he's awake by this time to what he's got. He'll try to sell them to Bronson, probably." "Or to us," I put in. We said nothing for a few minutes. McKnight smoked a cigarette and stared at a photograph of Candida over the mantel. Candida is the best pony for a heavy mount in 7 states. "I didn't go to Richmond," he observed finally. The remark followed my own thoughts so closely that I started. "Miss West is not home yet from Seal Harbour." Receiving no response, he lapsed again into thoughtful silence. Mrs. Clopton came in just as the clock struck 1, and made preparation for the night by putting a large, gaudy comfortable into an armchair in the dressing-room, with a smaller, stiff-backed chair for her feet. She was wonderfully attired in a dressing-gown that was reminiscent, in parts, of all the ones she had given me for 6 Christmases, and she had a purple veil wrapped around her head, to hide heaven knows what deficiency. She examined the empty eggnog glass, inquired what the evening paper had said about the weather, and then stalked into the dressing-room and prepared, with much ostentatious creaking, to sit up all night. We fell silent again, while McKnight traced a rough outline of the burrs on the white table-cover, and puzzled it out slowly. It was something like this. Reader's note. And here you see a rectangle divided into 3 sections longwise to represent a train car. The middle section is labeled aisle. The top section is labeled with the burrs 12, 10, and 8. The bottom section is labeled with the burrs 11, 9, and 7. End of reader's note. You think he changed the tags on 7 and 9, so that when you went back to bed you thought you were crawling into 9 when it was really 7, eh? Probably, yes. Then, toward morning, when everybody was asleep, your theory is that he changed the numbers again and left the train. I can't think of anything else, I replied wearily. Jove, what a game of bridge that fellow would play! It was like finessing an 8 spot and winning out. They would scarcely have doubted your story had the tags been reversed in the morning. He certainly left you in a bad way. Not a jury in the country would stand out against the stains, the stiletto, and the murdered man's pocketbook in your possession. Then you think Sullivan did it? I asked. Of course, said McKnight confidently. Unless you did it in your sleep. Look at the stains on his pillow, and the dirk stuck into it. And didn't he have the man Harrington's pocketbook? But why did he go off without the money? I persisted. And where does the bronze-haired girl come in? Search me, McKnight retorted flippantly. Inflammation of the imagination on your part. Then there's the piece of telegram. It said lower 10, car 7. It's extremely likely that she had it. That telegram was about me, Richie. I'm getting a headache, he said, putting out his cigarette against the sole of his shoe. "All I'm certain of just now is if there hadn't been a wreck by this time you'd be sitting in an 8x10 cell and feeling like the rhyme for it. But listen to this," I continued as he picked up his hat. "This fellow Sullivan is a fugitive, and he's a lot more likely to make advances to Bronson than to us. We could have the case continued, release Bronson on bail, and set a watch on him." "Not my watch," McKnight protested. "It's a family heirloom." "You'd better go home," I said firmly. "Go home and go to bed. You're sleepy. You can have Sullivan's red necktie to dream over, if you think it will help any." Mrs. Clopton's voice came drowsily from the next room, punctuated by a yawn. "Oh, I forgot to tell you," she called, with the suspicious lisp which characterizes her at night. "Somebody else called up about noon, Mr. Lawrence. It was a long distance, and he said he would call again. The name was," she yawned, "Sullivan." Chapter 12 of The Man in Lower Ten. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower Ten by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 12. The Gold Bag. I have always smiled at those cases of spontaneous combustion which, like fusing the component parts of a Zeitlitz powder, unite two people in a bubbling and ephemeral ecstasy. But surely there is possible, but with a single meeting, an attraction so great, a community of mind and interest so strong, that between the first meeting and the next the bond may grow into something stronger. This is especially true, I fancy, of people with temperament, the modern substitute for imagination. It is a nice question whether lovers begin to love when they are together or when they are apart. Not that I followed any such line of reasoning at the time. I would not even admit my folly to myself. But during the restless hours of that first night after the accident, when my back ached with lying on it, and any other position was torture, I found my thoughts constantly going back to Alison West. I dropped into a doze, to dream of touching her fingers again to comfort her, and awoke to find that I had patted a teaspoonful of medicine out of Mrs. Clopton's indignant hand. What was it McKnight had said about making an egregious ass of myself? And that brought me back to Ritchie, and I fancy I groaned. There is no use expatiating on the friendship between two men who have gone together through college, have quarrelled and made up, fussed together over politics and debated creeds for years. Men don't need to be told, and women cannot understand. Nevertheless I groaned. If it had been any one but Rich. Some things were mine, however, and I would hold them. The halcyon breakfast, the queer hat, the pebble in her small shoe, the gold bag with the broken chain. The bag! Why, it was in my pocket at that moment. I got up painfully and found my coat. Yes, there was the purse, bulging with an opulent suggestion of wealth inside. I went back to bed again, somewhat dizzy, between effort and the touch of the trinket so lately hers. I held it up by its broken chain and gloated over it. By careful attention to orders, I ought to be out in a day or so. Then I could return it to her. I really ought to do that. It was valuable, and I wouldn't care to trust it to the mail. I could run down to Richmond and see her once. There was no disloyalty to Rich in that. I had no intention of opening the bag. I put it under my pillow, which was my reason for refusing to have the linen slips changed, to Mrs. Clopton's dismay. And sometime during the morning, when I lay under a virgin field of white, ornamented with strange flowers, my cigarettes hidden beyond discovery, and Science and Health on a table by my elbow, as if by the merest accident I slid my hand under my pillow and touched it reverently. McKnight came in about 11. I heard his car at the curb, followed almost immediately by his slam at the front door, and his usual clamour on the stairs. He had a bottle under his arm, rightly surmising that I had been forbidden stimulant, and a large box of cigarettes in his pocket, suspecting my deprivation. "Well," he said cheerfully, "how did you sleep after keeping me up half the night?" I slid my hand around. The purse was well covered. "Have it now, or wait till I get the cork out?" he rattled on. "I don't want anything," I protested. "I wish you wouldn't be so darned cheerful, Ritchie." He stopped whistling to stare at me. "I am saddest when I sing," he quoted unctuously. "It's pure reaction, Lolly. Yesterday the sky was low. I was digging for my best friend. Today he lies before me, his peevish self. Yesterday I thought the notes were burned. Today, I look forward to a good cross-country chase, and with luck we will draw." His voice changed suddenly. "Yesterday, she was in Seal Harbor. Today, she is here." "Here in Washington?" I asked, as naturally as I could. "Yes, going to stay a week or two." "Oh, I had a little hen, and she had a wooden leg, and nearly every morning she used to lay an egg." "Will you stop that racket, Rich? It's the real thing this time, I suppose." "She's the best little chicken that we have on the farm, and another little drink won't do us any harm," he finished, twisting out the corkscrew. Then he came over and sat down on the bed. "Well," he said, judiciously, "since you drag it from me, I think perhaps it is. You're such a confirmed woman-hater that I hardly knew how you would take it." "Nothing of the sort," I denied, testily. "Because a man reaches the age of 30 without making maudlin love to everything." "I've taken to long country rides," he went on reflectively, without listening to me, "and yesterday I ran over a sheep. Nearly went into the ditch. But there's a Providence that watches over fools and lovers, and just now I know darned well that I'm one, and I have a sneaking idea I'm both." "You are both," I said with disgust. "If you can be rational for one moment, I wish you would tell me why that man Sullivan called me over the telephone yesterday morning." "Probably hadn't yet discovered the Bronson notes, providing you hold to your theory that the theft was incidental to the murder. May have wanted his own clothes again, or to thank you for yours. Search me, I can't think of anything else." The doctor came in just then. As I said before, I think a lot of my doctor, when I am ill. He is a young man, with an air of breezy self-confidence and good humour. He looked directly past the bottle, which is a very valuable accomplishment, and shook hands with McKnight until I could put the cigarettes under the bedclothes. He had interdicted tobacco. Then he sat down beside the bed and felt around the bandages with hands as gentle as a baby's. "Pretty good shape," he said. "How did you sleep?" "Oh, occasionally," I replied. "I would like to sit up, doctor." "Nonsense. Take a rest while you have an excuse for it. I wish to thunder I could stay in bed for a day or two. I was up all night." "Have a drink," McKnight said, pushing over the bottle. "Twins," the doctor grinned. "Have 2 drinks." But the medical man refused. "I wouldn't even wear a champagne-colored necktie during business hours," he explained. "By the way, I had another case from your accident, Mr. Blakely, late yesterday afternoon. Under the tongue, please." He stuck a thermometer in my mouth. I had a sudden terrible vision of the amateur detective coming to light, notebook, cheerful impertinence, and incriminating data. "A small man?" I demanded. "Grey hair?" "Keep your mouth closed," the doctor said peremptorily. "No, a woman with a fractured skull. Beautiful case. Van Kirk was up to his eyes and sent for me. Hemorrhage. Right-sided paralysis. Irregular pupils. All the trimmings. Worked for 2 hours." "Did she recover?" McKnight put in. He was examining the doctor with new awe. "She lifted her right arm before I left," the doctor finished cheerfully. "So the operation was a success, even if she should die." "Good heavens!" McKnight broke in. "And I thought you were just an ordinary mortal like the rest of us. Let me touch you for luck. Was she pretty?" "Yes, and young. Had a wealth of bronze-colored hair. Upon my soul, I hated to cut it." McKnight and I exchanged glances. "Do you know her name, doctor?" I asked. "No. The nurses said her clothing came from a Pittsburgh tailor." "She is not conscious, I suppose?" "No. She may be. Tomorrow or in a week." He looked at the thermometer, murmured something about liquid diet, avoiding my eye Mrs. Clopton was broiling a chop at the time and took his departure, humming cheerfully as he went downstairs. McKnight looked after him wistfully. "Jove! I wish I had his constitution!" he exclaimed. "Neither nerves nor heart. What a chauffeur he would make!" But I was serious. "I have an idea," I said grimly, "that this small matter of the murder is going to come up again, and that your uncle will be in the deuce of a fix if it does. If that woman is going to die, somebody ought to be around to take her deposition. She knows a lot, if she didn't do it herself. I wish you would go down to the telephone and get the hospital. Find out her name and if she is conscious." McKnight went under protest. "I haven't much time," he said, looking at his watch. "I'm to meet Miss West and Alison at 1. I want you to know them, Lolly. You would like the mother." "Why not the daughter?" I inquired. I touched the little gold bag under my pillow. "Well," he said judiciously, "you've always declared against the immaturity and romantic nonsense of very young women." "I never said anything of the sort," I retorted furiously. "There is more satisfaction to be had out of a good saddle horse," he quoted me. "More excitement out of a polo pony, and as for the eternal matrimonial chase, give me instead a good stubble, a fox, some decent dogs, and a hunter, and I'll show you the real joys of the chase." "For heaven's sake, go down to the telephone. You make my head ache," I said savagely. I hardly know what prompted me to take out the gold purse and look at it. It was an imbecile thing to do. Call it impure, sentimental, what you wish. I brought it out, one eye on the door, for Mrs. Clopton had a ready eye and a noiseless shoe. But the house was quiet. Downstairs McKnight was flirting with the telephone central, and there was an odour of boneset tea in the air. I think Mrs. Clopton was fascinated out of her theories by the boneset in connection with the fractured arm. Anyhow, I held up the bag and looked at it. It must have unfastened, for the next instant there was an avalanche on the snowfield of the counterpane. Some money, a wisp of handkerchief, a tiny booklet with thin leaves, covered with a powdery substance, and a necklace. I drew myself up slowly and stared at the necklace. It was one of the semi-barbaric affairs that women are wearing now, a heavy pendant of gold chains and carved cameos, swung from a thin chain of the same metal. The necklace was broken. In 3 places the links were pulled apart and the cameos swung loose and partly detached. But it was the supporting chain that held my eye and fascinated with its sinister suggestion. 3 inches of it had been snapped off, and as well as I knew anything on earth, I knew that the bit of chain that the amateur detective had found, bloodstain and all, belonged just there. And there was no one I could talk to about it, no one to tell me how hideously absurd it was, no one to give me a slap and tell me there are tons of fine gold chains made every year, or to point out the long arm of coincidence. With my one useful hand I fumbled the things back into the bag and thrust it deep out of sight under the pillows. Then I lay back in a cold perspiration. What connection had Alison West with this crime? Why had she stared so at the gunmetal cigarette case that morning on the train? What had alarmed her so at the farmhouse? What had she taken back to the gate? Why did she wish she had not escaped from the wreck? And last, in heaven's name, how did a part of her necklace become torn off and covered with blood? Downstairs McKnight was still at the telephone and amusing himself with Mrs. Clopton in the interval of waiting. "Why did he come home in a grey suit when he went away in a blue?" he repeated. "Well, wrecks are queer things, Mrs. Clopton. The suit may have turned grey with fright. Or perhaps wrecks do as queer stunts as lightning. Friend of mine once was struck by lightning. He and the caddie had taken refuge under a tree. After the flash, when they recovered consciousness, there was my friend in the caddie's clothes, and the caddie in his. And as my friend was a large man and the caddie a very small boy—" McKnight's story was interrupted by the indignant slam of the dining-room door. He was obliged to wait some time, and even his eternal cheerfulness was ebbing when he finally got the hospital. "Is Dr. Van Kirk there?" he asked. "Not there? Well, can you tell me how the patient is whom Dr. Williams from Washington operated on last night? Well, I'm glad of that. Is she conscious? Do you happen to know her name? Yes, I'll hold the line." There was a long pause, then McKnight's voice. "Hello? Yes? Thank you very much. Good-bye." He came upstairs, 2 steps at a time. "Look here," he said, bursting into the room. "There may be something in your theory, after all. The woman's name, it may be a coincidence, but it's curious. Her name is Sullivan." "What did I tell you?" I said, sitting up suddenly in bed. "She's probably a sister of that scoundrel in lower 7, and she was afraid of what he might do." "Well, I'll go there some day soon. She's not conscious yet. In the meantime, the only thing I can do is keep an eye, through a detective, on the people who try to approach Bronson. We'll have the case continued, anyhow, in the hope that the stolen notes will sooner or later turn up." "Confound this arm," I said, paying for my energy with some excruciating throbs. "There's so much to be looked after, and here I am, bandaged, splinted, and generally useless. It's a beastly shame." "Don't forget that I am here," said McKnight pompously. "And another thing. When you feel that way, just remember there are 2 less desirable places where you might be. One is jail, and the other is—" He strummed on an imaginary harp, with devotional eyes. But McKnight's light-heartedness jarred on me that morning. I lay and frowned under my helplessness. When by chance I touched the little gold bag, it seemed to scorch my fingers. Ritchie, finding me unresponsive, left to keep his luncheon engagement with Alison West. As he clattered down the stairs, I turned my back to the morning sunshine and abandoned myself to misery. By what strain on her frayed nerves was Alison West keeping up, I wondered. Under the circumstances, would I dare to return the bag? Knowing that I had it, would she hate me for my knowledge? Or had I exaggerated the importance of the necklace, and in that case she had forgotten me already? But McKnight had not gone after all, and I heard him coming back, his voice preceding him, and I groaned with irritation. "Wake up," he called. "Somebody's sent you a lot of flowers. Please hold the box, Mrs. Clopton. I'm going to be run down by an automobile." I roused my feeble interest. My brother's wife is punctilious about such things. All the new babies in the family have silver rattles, and all the sick people flowers. McKnight pulled up an armful of roses and held them out to me. "Wonder who they're from," he said, fumbling in the box for a card. "There's no name. Yes, here's one." He held it up and read it with exasperating slowness. "Best wishes for an early recovery. A companion in misfortune." "Well, what do you know about that?" he exclaimed. "There's something you didn't tell me, Lolly." "It was hardly worth mentioning," I said mendaciously, with my heart beating until I could hear it. She had not forgotten after all. McKnight took a bud and fastened it in his buttonhole. I am afraid I was not especially pleasant about it. They were her roses, and anyhow they were meant for me. Ritchie left very soon, with an irritating final grin at the box. "Good-bye, Sir Woman-Hater," he jeered at me from the door. So he wore one of the roses she had sent me to luncheon with her, and I lay back among my pillows and tried to remember that it was his game anyhow, and that I wasn't even drawing cards. To remember that, and to forget the broken necklace under my head. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 13. Faded Roses. I was in the house for a week. Much of that time I spent in composing and destroying letters of thanks to Miss West, and in growling at the doctor. McKnight dropped in daily, but he was less cheerful than usual. Now and then I caught him eyeing me as if he had something to say, but whatever it was, he kept it to himself. Once during the week he went to Baltimore and saw the woman in the hospital there. From the description I had little difficulty in recognizing the young woman who had been with the murdered man in Pittsburgh. But she was still unconscious. An elderly aunt had appeared, a gaunt person in black, who sat around like a buzzard on a fence, according to McKnight, and wept, in a mixed figure, into a damp handkerchief. On the last day of my imprisonment he stopped in to thrash out a case that was coming up in court the next day, and to play a game of double solitaire with me. "Who won the ball game?" I asked. "We were licked. Ask me something pleasant. Oh, by the way, Bronson's out today." "I'm glad I'm not on his bond," I said pessimistically. "He'll clear out." "Not he." McKnight pounced on my ace. "He's no fool. Don't you suppose he knows you took the notes to Pittsburgh? The papers were full of it. And he knows you escaped with your life and a broken arm from the wreck. What do we do next? The Commonwealth continues the case. A deaf man on a dark night would know those notes are missing." "Don't play so fast," I remonstrated. "I have only one arm to your two. Who is trailing Bronson? Did you try to get Johnson?" "I asked for him, but he had some work on hand." "The murder's evidently a dead issue," I reflected. "No, I'm not joking. The wreck destroyed all the evidence, but I'm firmly convinced those notes will be offered, either to us or to Bronson very soon. Johnson's a blackguard, but he's a good detective. He could make his fortune as a game dog. What's he doing?" McKnight put down his cards and rising went to the window. As he held the curtain back, his customary grin looked a little forced. "To tell you the truth, Lolly," he said, "for the last 2 days he's been watching a well-known Washington attorney named Lawrence Blakely. He's across the street now." It took a moment for me to grasp what he meant. "Why, it's ridiculous," I asserted. "What would they trail me for? Go over and tell Johnson to get out of there, or I'll pot at him with my revolver." "You can tell him that yourself." McKnight paused and bent forward. "Hello, here's a visitor, a little man with a string halt." "I won't see him," I said firmly. "I've been bothered enough with reporters." We listened together to Mrs. Clopton's expostulating tones in the lower hall, and the creak of the boards as she came heavily up the stairs. She had a piece of paper in her hand torn from a pocket account book, and on it was the name, Mr. Wilson Budd Hotchkiss, Important Business. "Oh, well, show him up," I said resignedly. "You'd better put those cards away, Ritchie. I fancy it's the rector of the church around the corner." But when the door opened to admit a curiously alert little man, adjusting his glasses with nervous fingers, my face must have shown my dismay. It was the amateur detective of the Ontario. I shook hands without enthusiasm. He was the one survivor of the wrecked car who could do me any amount of harm. There was no hope that he had forgotten any of the incriminating details. In fact, he held them in his hand, the very notebook which contained them. His manner was restrained, but it was evident he was highly excited. I introduced him to McKnight, who has the imagination I lack, and who placed him at once, mentally. "I only learned yesterday that you had been saved," he said rapidly. "Terrible accident. Unspeakable. Dream about it all night and think about it all day. Broken arm?" "No, he just wears the splint to be different from other people," McKnight drawled lazily. I glared at him. There was nothing to be gained by antagonizing the little man. "Yes, a fractured humerus, which isn't as funny as it sounds." Humerus. Pretty good," he cackled. "I must say you keep up your spirits pretty well, considering everything." "You seem to have escaped injury," I parried. He was fumbling for something in his pockets. "Yes, I escaped," he replied abstractedly. "Remarkable thing, too. I haven't a doubt I would have broken my neck, but I landed on you'll never guess what. I landed head first on the very pillow which was under inspection at the time of the wreck. You remember, don't you? Where did I put that package?" He found it finally and opened it on a table, displaying with some theatricalism a rectangular piece of muslin and a similar patch of striped ticking. "You recognize it?" he said. "The stains, you see, and the hole made by the dirk. I tried to bring away the entire pillow, but they thought I was stealing it and made me give it up." Ritchie touched the pieces gingerly. "By George!" he said. "And you carry that around in your pocket? What if you should mistake it for your handkerchief?" But Mr. Hotchkiss was not listening. He stood bent somewhat forward, leaning over the table, and fixed me with his ferret-like eyes. "Have you seen the evening papers, Mr. Blakely?" he inquired. I glanced to where they lay unopened and shook my head. "Then I have a disagreeable task," he said with evident relish. "Of course, you had considered the matter of the man Harrington's death closed, after the wreck. I did myself. As far as I was concerned, I meant to let it remain so. There were no other survivors, at least none that I knew of, and in spite of circumstances, there were a number of points in your favour." "Thank you," I put in with a sarcasm that was lost on him. "I verified your identity, for instance, as soon as I recovered from the shock. Also, I found on inquiring of your tailor that you invariably wore dark clothing." McKnight came forward threateningly. "Who are you, anyhow?" he demanded. "And how is this any business of yours?" Mr. Hotchkiss was entirely unruffled. "I have a minor position here," he said, reaching for a visiting card. "I am a very small patch on the seat of government, sir." McKnight muttered something about certain offensive designs against the said patch, and retired grumblingly to the window. Our visitor was opening the paper with a tremendous expenditure of energy. "Here it is. Listen!" He read rapidly aloud. "The Pittsburgh police have sent to Baltimore 2 detectives who are looking up the survivors of the ill-fated Washington flyer. It has transpired that Simon Harrington, the Wood Street merchant of that city, was not killed in the wreck, but was murdered in his berth the night preceding the accident. Shortly before the collision, John Flanders, the conductor of the flyer, sent this telegram to the chief of police: Body of Simon Harrington found stabbed in his berth, Lower 10, Ontario, at 6:30 this morning. John Flanders, conductor. It is hoped that the survivors of the wrecked car Ontario will be found, to tell what they know of the discovery of the crime. Mr. John Gilmore, head of the steel company for which Mr. Harrington was purchasing agent, has signified his intention of sifting the matter to the bottom. So you see," Hotchkiss continued, "there's trouble brewing. You and I are the only survivors of that unfortunate car." I did not contradict him, but I knew of 2 others at least, Alison West and the woman we had left beside the road that morning, babbling incoherently, her black hair tumbling over her white face. "Unless we can find the man who occupied lower 7, I suggested. "I have already tried and failed. To find him would not clear you, of course, unless we could establish some connection between him and the murdered man. It is the only thing I see, however. I have learned this much," Hotchkiss concluded. "Lower 7 was reserved from Cresson." Cresson! Where Alison West and Mrs. Curtis had taken the train. McKnight came forward and suddenly held out his hand. "Mr. Hotchkiss," he said, I'm sorry if I have been offensive. I thought when you came in that, like the Irishmen and the government, you were forninst us. If you will put those cheerful relics out of sight somewhere, I shall be glad to have you dine with me at the Incubator," his name for his bachelor apartment. "Compared with Johnson, you are the great original protoplasm." The strength of this was lost on Hotchkiss, but the invitation was clear. They went out together, and from my window I watched them get into McKnight's car. It was raining, and at the corner the Cannonball skidded. Across the street, my detective, Johnson, looked after them with his crooked smile. As he turned up his collar he saw me, and lifted his hat. I left the window and sat down in the growing dusk. So the occupant of lower 7 had got on the car at Cresson, probably with Alison West and her companion. There was someone she cared about enough to shield. I went irritably to the door and summoned Mrs. Clopton. "You may throw out those roses," I said without looking at her. "They are quite dead." "They have been quite dead for 3 days," she retorted spitefully. "Euphemia said you threatened to dismiss her if she touched them." Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 14. The Trap Door. By Sunday evening, a week after the wreck, my forced inaction had goaded me to frenzy. The very sight of Johnson across the street or lurking, always within sight of the house, kept me constantly exasperated. It was on that day that things began to come to a focus, a burning glass of events that seemed to centre on me. I dined alone that evening in no cheerful frame of mind. There had been a polo game the day before, and I had lent a pony, which is always a bad thing to do, and she had wrenched her shoulder, besides helping to lose the game. There was no one in town. The temperature was 90 and climbing, and my left hand persistently cramped under its bandage. Mrs. Clopton herself saw me served, my bread buttered and cut in tidbits, my meat ready for my fork. She hovered around me maternally, obviously trying to cheer me. "The paper says still warmer," she ventured. "The thermometer is 92 now." "And this coffee is 250, I said, putting down my cup. "Where is Euphemia? I haven't seen her around, or heard a dish smash all day." "Euphemia is in bed," Mrs. Clopton said gravely. "Is your meat cut small enough, Mr. Lawrence?" Mrs. Clopton can throw more mystery into an ordinary sentence than anyone I know. She can say, "Are your sheets damp, sir?" and I can tell from her tone that the house across the street has been robbed, or that my left-hand neighbour has appendicitis. So now I looked up and asked the question she was waiting for. "What's the matter with Euphemia?" I inquired idly. "Frightened into her bed," Mrs. Clopton said in a stage whisper. "She's had 3 hot water bottles, and she hasn't done a thing all day but moan." "She oughtn't to take hot water bottles," I said in my severest tone. "One would make me moan. You need not wait. I'll ring if I need anything." Mrs. Clopton sailed to the door, where she stopped and wheeled indignantly. "I only hope you won't laugh on the wrong side of your face some morning, Mr. Lawrence," she declared with Christian fortitude. "But I warn you, I am going to have the police watch that house next door." I was half inclined to tell her that both it and we were under police surveillance at that moment. But I like Mrs. Clopton, in spite of the fact that I make her life a torment for her, so I refrained. "Last night, when the paper said it was going to storm, I sent Euphemia to the roof to bring the rugs in. Eliza had slipped out, although it was her evening in. Euphemia went up to the roof. It was 11 o'clock, and soon I heard her running downstairs crying. When she got to my room she just folded up on the floor. She said there was a black figure sitting on the parapet of the house next door, the empty house, and that when she appeared it rose and waved long black arms at her, and spit like a cat. I had finished my dinner and was lighting a cigarette. If there was any one up there, which I doubt, they probably sneezed, I suggested. But if you feel uneasy, I'll take a look around the roof tonight before I turn in. As far as Euphemia goes, I wouldn't be uneasy about her. Doesn't she always have an attack of some sort when Eliza rings in an extra evening on her? So I made a superficial examination of the window locks that night, visiting parts of the house that I had not seen since I bought it. Then I went to the roof. Evidently it had not been intended for any purpose save to cover the house, for unlike the houses around, there was no staircase. A ladder and a trap-door led to it, and it required some nice balancing on my part to get up with my useless arm. I made it, however, and found this unexplored part of my domain rather attractive. It was cooler than downstairs, and I sat on the brick parapet and smoked my final cigarette. The roof of the empty house adjoined mine along the back wing, but investigation showed that the trap-door across the low dividing wall was bolted underneath. There was nothing out of the ordinary anywhere, and so I assured Mrs. Clopton. Needless to say, I did not tell her that I had left the trap-door open to see if it would improve the temperature of the house. I went to bed at midnight, merely because there was nothing else to do. I turned on the lamp at the head of my bed, and picked up a volume of Shaw at random. It was Arms and the Man, and I remember thinking grimly that I was a good bit of a chocolate-cream soldier myself, and prepared to go to sleep. Shaw always puts me to sleep. I have no apologies to make for what occurred that night, and not even an explanation that I am sure of. I did a foolish thing under impulse, and I have not been sorry. It was something after 2 when the doorbell rang. It rang quickly, twice. I got up drowsily, for the maids and Mrs. Clopton always locked themselves beyond reach of the bell at night, and put on a dressing-gown. The bell rang again on my way downstairs. I lit the hall light and opened the door. I was wide awake now, and I saw that it was Johnson. His bald head shone in the light, his crooked mouth was twisted in a smile. "Good heavens, man," I said irritably. "Don't you ever go home and go to bed?" He closed the vestibule door behind him, and cavalierly turned out the light. Our dialogue was sharp, staccato. "Have you got a key to the empty house next door?" he demanded. "Somebody's in there, and the latch is caught." "The houses are alike. The key to this door may fit. Did you see them go in?" "No. There's a light moving up from room to room. I saw something like it last night, and I have been watching. The patrolman reported queer doings there a week or so ago." "A light!" I exclaimed. "Do you mean that you—" "Very likely," he said grimly. "Have you a revolver?" "All kinds in the gun rack," I replied, and going to the den, I came back with a Smith & Wesson. "I'm not much use," I explained, "but I'll do what I can. There may be somebody there. The servants here have been uneasy." Johnson planned the campaign. He suggested on account of my familiarity with the roof that I go there and cut off escape in that direction. "I have Robinson out there now, the patrolman on the beat," he said. "He'll watch below and you above while I search the house. Be as quiet as possible." I was rather amused. I put on some clothes and felt my way carefully up the stairs, the revolver swinging free in my pocket, my hand on the rail. At the foot of the ladder I stopped and looked up. Above me was a grey rectangle of sky dotted with stars. It occurred to me that with my one serviceable hand holding the ladder, I was hardly in a position to defend myself, that I was about to hoist a body that I am rather careful of into a danger I couldn't see and wasn't particularly keen about anyhow. I don't mind saying that the seconds it took me to scramble up the ladder were among the most unpleasant that I recall. I got to the top, however, without incident. I could see fairly well after the darkness of the house beneath, but there was nothing suspicious in sight. The roofs, separated by 2 feet of brick wall, stretched about me, unbroken save by an occasional chimney. I went very softly over to the other trap, the one belonging to the suspected house. It was closed, but I imagined I could hear Johnson's footsteps ascending heavily. Then even that was gone. A near-by clock struck 3 as I stood waiting. I examined my revolver, then, for the first time, and found it was empty. I had been rather sceptical until now. I had the usual tolerant attitude of the man who is summoned from his bed to search for burglars, combined with the artificial courage of firearms. With the discovery of my empty gun, I felt like a man on the top of a volcano in lively eruption. Suddenly I found myself staring incredulously at the trap door at my feet. I had examined it early in the evening and found it bolted. Did I imagine it, or had it raised about an inch? Wasn't it moving slowly as I looked? No, I am not a hero. I was startled almost into a panic. I had one arm, and whoever was raising that trapdoor had two. My knees had a queer inclination to bend the wrong way. Johnson's footsteps were distinct enough, but he was evidently far below. The trap, raised perhaps 2 inches now, remained stationary. There was no sound from beneath it. Once I thought I heard 2 or 3 gasping respirations, but I am not sure they were not my own. I wanted desperately to stand on one leg at a time and hold the other up out of focus of a possible revolver. I did not see the hand appear. There was nothing there, and then it was there, clutching the frame of the trap. I did the only thing I could think of. I put my foot on it. There was not a sound from beneath. The next moment I was kneeling and had clutched the wrist just above the hand. After a second's struggle the arm was still. With something real to face, I was myself again. "Don't move, or I'll stand on the trap and break your arm," I panted. What else could I threaten? I couldn't shoot, and I couldn't even fight. "Johnson!" I called. And then I realized the thing that stayed with me for a month, the thing I can now think of even without a shudder. The hand lay ice cold, strangely quiescent. Under my fingers an artery was beating feebly. The wrist was as slender as... I held it to the light. Then I let it drop. "Good Lord!" I muttered, and remained on my knees, standing at the spot where the hand had been. It was gone now. There was a faint rustle in the darkness below, and then silence. I held up my own hand in the starlight and stared at a long scratch in the palm. "A woman!" I said to myself stupidly. "By all that's ridiculous, a woman!" Johnson was striking matches below and swearing softly to himself. "How the devil do you get to the roof?" he called. "I think I've broken my nose." He found the ladder after a short search and stood at the bottom, looking up at me. "Well, I suppose you haven't seen him?" he inquired. "There are enough darned cubby holes in this house to hide a patrol wagon load of thieves." He lighted a fresh match. "Hello, here's another door." By the sound of his diminishing footsteps I supposed it was a real staircase. He came up again in 10 minutes or so, this time with the policeman. "He's gone all right," he said ruefully. "If you'd been attending to your business, Robinson, you would have watched the back door." "I'm not twins." Robinson was surly. "Well," I broke in as cheerfully as I could, "if you are through with this jolly little affair, and can get down the ladder without having my housekeeper ring the burglar alarm, I have some good Monongahela whiskey, eh?" They came without a second invitation across the roof, and with them safely away from the house I breathed more freely. Down in the den I fulfilled my promise, which Johnson drank to the toast, coming through the rye. He examined my gun rack with the eye of a connoisseur, and even when he was about to go he cast a loving eye back at the weapons. "Ever been in the army?" he inquired. "No," I said with a bitterness that he noticed but failed to comprehend. "I'm a chocolate cream soldier. You don't read Shaw, I suppose, Johnson?" "Never heard of him," the detective said indifferently. "Well, good night, Mr. Blakely. Much obliged." At the door he hesitated and coughed. "I suppose you understand, Mr. Blakely," he said awkwardly, "that this surveillance is all in a day's work? I don't like it, but it's duty. Every man to his duty, sir." "Sometime, when you are in an open mind, Johnson," I returned, "you can explain why I am being watched at all." Chapter 15 of The Man in Lower Ten. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower Ten by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 15. The Cinematograph. On Monday, I went out for the first time. I did not go to the office. I wanted to walk. I thought fresh air and exercise would drive away the blue devils that had me by the throat. McKnight insisted on a long day in his car, but I refused. "I don't know why not," he said sulkily. "I can't walk. I haven't walked 2 consecutive blocks in 3 years. Automobiles have made legs mere ornaments, and some not even that. We could have Johnson out there chasing us over the country at $5 an hour." "He can chase us just as well at 5 miles an hour," I said. "But what gets me, McKnight, is why I am under surveillance at all. How do the police know I was accused of that thing?" "The young lady who sent the flowers. She isn't likely to talk, is she?" "No. That is, I didn't say it was a lady." I groaned as I tried to get my splinted arm into a coat. "Anyhow, she didn't tell," I finished with conviction, and McKnight laughed. It had rained in the early morning, and Mrs. Clopton predicted more showers. In fact, so firm was her belief, and so determined her eye, that I took the umbrella she proffered me. "Never mind," I said. "We can leave it next door. I have a story to tell you, Ritchie, and it requires proper setting." McKnight was puzzled, but he followed me obediently around to the kitchen entrance of the empty house. It was unlocked, as I had expected. While we climbed to the upper floor, I retailed the events of the previous night. "It's the finest thing I ever heard of," McKnight said, staring up at the ladder and the trap. "What a vaudeville skit it would make! Only, you ought not to have put your foot on her hand. They don't do that in the best circles." I wheeled on him impatiently. "You don't understand the situation at all, Ritchie," I exclaimed. "What would you say if I tell you it was the hand of a lady? It was covered with rings." "A lady?" he repeated. "Why, I'd say it was a darned compromising situation, and that the less you say of it, the better. Look here, Lawrence, I think you dreamed it. You've been in the house too much. I'll take it all back. You do need exercise." "She escaped through this door, I suppose," I said as patiently as I could. "Evidently down the back staircase. We might as well go down that way." "According to the best precedents in these affairs, we should find a glove about here," he said as we started down. But he was more impressed than he cared to own. He examined the dusty steps carefully, and once, when a bit of loose plaster fell just behind him, he started like a nervous woman. "What I don't understand is why you let her go," he said, stopping once, puzzled. "You're not usually quixotic." "When we get out into the country, Ritchie," I replied gravely, "I'm going to tell you another story. And if you don't tell me I'm a fool and a craven on the strength of it, you are no friend of mine." We stumbled through the twilight of the staircase into the blackness of the shuttered kitchen. The house had the mouldy smell of closed buildings. Even on that warm September morning it was damp and chilly. As we stepped into the sunshine, McKnight gave a shiver. "Now that we're out," he said, "I don't mind telling you that I have been there before. Do you remember the night you left, and the face at the window?" "When you speak of it, yes." "Well, I was curious about that thing," he went on, as we started up the street, "and I went back. The street door was unlocked, and I examined every room. I was Mrs. Clopton's ghost that carried a light and clum." "Did you find anything?" "Only a clean place rubbed on the window opposite your dressing room. Splendid view of an untidy interior. If that house is ever occupied, you'd better put stained glass in that window of yours." As we turned the corner I glanced back. Half a block between us, Johnson was moving our way slowly. When he saw me he stopped and proceeded with great deliberation to light a cigar. By hurrying, however, he caught the car that we took, and stood unobtrusively on the rear platform. He looked fagged, and absent-mindedly paid our fares, to McKnight's delight. "We will give him a run for his money," he declared, as the car moved countryward. "Conductor, let us off at the muddiest lane you can find." At 1:00, after a 6-mile ramble, we entered a small country hotel. We had seen nothing of Johnson for a half hour. At that time he was a quarter of a mile behind us and losing rapidly. Before we had finished our luncheon he staggered into the inn. One of his boots was under his arm, and his whole appearance was deplorable. He was coated with mud, streaked with perspiration, and he limped as he walked. He chose a table not far from us and ordered Scotch. Beyond touching his hat, he paid no attention to us. "I'm just getting my second wind," McKnight declared. "How do you feel, Mr. Johnson? 6 or 8 miles more, and we'll all enjoy our dinners." Johnson put down the glass he raised to his lips without replying. The fact was, however, that I was like Johnson. I was soft from my week's inaction, and I was pretty well done up. McKnight, who was a wellspring of vitality and high spirits, ordered a strange concoction made of nearly everything in the bar and sent it over to the detective, but Johnson refused it. "I hate that kind of person," McKnight said pettishly. "Kind of fellow that thinks you're going to poison his dog if you offer him a bone." When we got back to the car line, with Johnson a draggled and drooping tail to the kite, I was in better spirits. I had told McKnight the story of the 3 hours just after the wreck. I had not named the girl, of course. She had my promise of secrecy. But I told him everything else. It was a relief to have a fresh mind on it. I had puzzled so much over the incident at the farmhouse, and the necklace in the gold bag, that I had lost perspective. He had been interested, but inclined to be amused, until I came to the broken chain. Then he had whistled softly. "But there are tons of fine gold chains made every year," he said. "Why in the world do you think that the smeary piece came from that necklace?" I had looked around. Johnson was far behind, scraping the mud off his feet with a piece of stick. "I have the short end of the chain in the sealskin bag," I reminded him. "When I couldn't sleep this morning, I thought I would settle it, one way or the other. It was hell to go along the way I had been doing. And there's no doubt about it, Rich. It's the same chain." We walked along in silence until we caught the car back to town. "Well," he said finally, "you know the girl, of course, and I don't. But if you like her, and I think myself you're rather hard hit, old man, I wouldn't give a whoop about the chain and the gold purse. It's just one of the little coincidences that hang people now and then. And as for last night, if she's the kind of girl you say she is, and you think she had anything to do with that, you're addled, that's all. You can depend on it. The lady of the empty house last week is the lady of last night. And yet your train acquaintance was in Altoona at that time." Just before we got off the car, I reverted to the subject again. It was never far back in my mind. "About the young lady of the train, Rich," I said, with what I suppose was elaborate carefulness. "I do not want you to get the wrong impression. I am rather unlikely to see her again, but even if I do, I believe she is already bespoke, or the next thing to it." He made no reply, but as I opened the door with my latchkey, he stood looking up at me from the pavement with his quizzical smile. "Love is like the measles," he orated. "The older you get, the worse the attack." Johnson did not appear again that day. A small man in a raincoat took his place. The next morning I made my initial trip to the office, the raincoat still in hand. I had a short conference with Miller, the district attorney, at 11. Bronson was under surveillance, he said, and any attempt to sell the notes to him would probably result in their recovery. In the meantime, as I knew, the Commonwealth had continued the case, in hope of such contingency. At noon, I left the office and took a veterinarian to see Candida, the injured pony. By 1 o'clock my first day's duties were performed, and a long Sahara of hot afternoons stretched ahead. McKnight, always glad to escape from the grind, suggested a vaudeville, and in sheer ennui I consented. I could neither ride, drive, nor golf, and my own company bored me to distraction. "Coolest place in town these days," he declared. "Electric fans, breezy songs, airy costumes, and there's Johnson just behind. The coldest proposition in Washington." He gravely bought 3 tickets and presented the detective with one. Then we went in. Having lived a normal, busy life, the theatre in the afternoon is about on par with ice cream for breakfast. Up on the stage, a very stout woman in short pink skirts, with a smile that McKnight declared looked like a slash in a roll of butter, was singing nasally, with a laborious kick at the end of each verse. Johnson, 2 rows ahead, went to sleep. McKnight prodded me with his elbow. "Look at the first box to the right," he said in a stage whisper. "I want you to come over at the end of this act." It was the first time I had seen her since I put her in the cab in Baltimore. Outwardly, I presume, I was calm, for no one turned to stare at me. But every atom of me cried out at the sight of her. She was leaning, bent forward, lips slightly parted, gazing raptly at the Japanese conjurer who had replaced what McKnight disrespectfully called the columns of Hercules. Compared with the draggled lady of the farmhouse, she was radiant. For that first moment there was nothing but joy at the sight of her. McKnight's touch on my arm brought me back to reality. "Come over and meet them," he said. "That's the cousin Miss West is visiting, Mrs. Dallas." But I would not go. After he went I sat there alone, painfully conscious that I was being pointed out and stared at from the box. The abominable Japanese gave way to yet more atrocious performing dogs. "How many offers of marriage will the young lady in the box have?" The dog stopped sagely at none, and then pulled out a card that said 8. Wild shouts of glee by the audience. "The fools," I muttered. After a little I glanced over. Mrs. Dallas was talking to McKnight, but she was looking straight at me. She was flushed, but more calm than I, and she did not bow. I fumbled for my hat, but the next moment I saw that they were going, and I sat still. When McKnight came back, he was triumphant. "I've made an engagement for you," he said. "Mrs. Dallas asked me to bring you to dinner tonight, and I said I knew you would fall all over yourself to go. You are requested to bring along the broken arm and any other souvenirs of the wreck that you may possess." "I'll do nothing of the sort," I declared, struggling against my inclination. "I can't even tie my necktie, and I have to have my food cut for me." "Oh, that's all right," he said easily. "I'll send Stogie over to fix you up, and Mrs. Dahl knows all about the arm. I told her." Stogie is his Japanese factotum, so called because he is lean, a yellowish-brown in colour, and because he claims to have been shipped into this country in a box. The cinematograph was finishing the programme. The house was dark, and the music had stopped, as it does in the circus just before somebody risks his neck at so much a neck in the dip of death or the 100-foot dive. Then, with a sort of shock, I saw on the white curtain the announcement: "The next picture is the doomed Washington flyer taken a short distance from the scene of the wreck on the fatal morning of September 10th. 2 miles farther on it met with almost complete annihilation." I confessed to a return of some of the sickening sensations of the wreck. People around me were leaning forward with tense faces. Then the letters were gone, and I saw a long, level stretch of track, even the broken stone between the ties standing out distinctly. Far off under a cloud of smoke a small object was rushing toward us and growing larger as it came. Now it was on us, a mammoth in size, with huge drivers and a colossal tender. The engines leaped aside, as if just in time to save us from destruction, with a glimpse of a stooping fireman and a grimy engineer. The long train of sleepers followed. From a forward vestibule, a porter in a white coat waved his hand. The rest of the cars seemed still wrapped in slumber. With mixed sensations, I saw my own car, Ontario, fly past, and then I rose to my feet and gripped McKnight's shoulder. On the lowest step of the last car, 1 foot hanging free, was a man. His black derby hat was pulled well down to keep it from blowing away, and his coat was flying open in the wind. He was swung well out from the car, his free hand gripping a small valise, every muscle tense for a jump. "Good God! That's my man!" I said hoarsely, as the audience broke into applause. McKnight half rose. In his seat ahead Johnson stifled a yawn and turned to eye me. I dropped into my chair limply and tried to control my excitement. "The man on the last platform of the train," I said. "He was just about to leap. I swear that was my bag." "Could you see his face?" McKnight asked in an undertone. "Would you know him again?" "No. His hat was pulled down and his head was bent. I'm going back to find out where that picture was taken. They say 2 miles, but it may have been 40. The audience, busy with its wraps, had not noticed. Mrs. Dallas and Alison West had gone. In front of us Johnson had dropped his hat and was stooping for it. "This way," I motioned to McKnight, and we wheeled into the narrow passage beside us, back of the boxes. At the end there was a door leading into the wings, and as we went boldly through I turned the key. The final set was being struck and no one paid any attention to us. Luckily they were similarly indifferent to a banging at the door I had locked, a banging which, I judged, signified Johnson. "I guess we've broken up his interference," McKnight chuckled. Stage hands were hurrying in every direction. Pieces of the side wall of the last drawing room menaced us. A switchboard behind us was singing like a tea kettle. Everywhere we stepped we were in somebody's way. At last we were across, confronting a man in his shirt sleeves, who by dots and dashes of profanity seemed to be directing the chaos. "Well," he said, wheeling on us, "what can I do for you?" "I would like to ask," I replied, "if you have any idea just where the last cinematograph picture was taken." "Broken boards? Picnickers? Lake?" "No, the Washington flyer." He glanced at my bandaged arm. "The announcement says 2 miles," McKnight put in. "But we should like to know whether it was railroad miles, automobile miles, or policeman miles. "I'm sorry I can't tell you," he replied more civilly. "We get those pictures by contract. We don't take them ourselves." "Where are the company's offices?" "New York." He stepped forward and grasped a super by the shoulder. "What in blazes are you doing with that gold chair and a kitchen set? Take that piece of pink plush there and throw it over a soap box if you haven't got a kitchen chair." I had not realized the extent of the shock, but now I dropped into a chair and wiped my forehead. The unexpected glimpse of Alison West, followed almost immediately by the revelation of the picture, had left me limp and unnerved. McKnight was looking at his watch. "He says the moving picture people have an office downtown. We can make it if we go now." So he called a cab, and we started at a gallop. There was no sign of the detective. "Upon my word," Ritchie said, "I feel lonely without him." The people at the downtown office of the Cinematograph Company were very obliging. The picture had been taken, they said, at M, just 2 miles beyond the scene of the wreck. It was not much, but it was something to work on. I decided not to go home, but to send McKnight's Jap for my clothes, and to dress at the incubator. I was determined, if possible, to make my next day's investigations without Johnson. In the meantime, even if it was for the last time, I would see her that night. I gave Stogie a note for Mrs. Clopton, and with my dinner clothes there came back the gold bag, wrapped in tissue paper. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Man in Lower 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 16. The Shadow of a Girl. Certain things about the dinner at the Dallas house will always be obscure to me. Dallas was something in the Fish Commission, and I remember his reeling off fish eggs in billions while we ate our caviar. He had some particular stunt he had been urging the government to for years, something about forbidding the establishment of mills and factories on river banks. It seems they kill the fish, either the smoke or the noise or something they pour into the water. Mrs. Dallas was there, I think. Of course, I suppose she must have been. And there was a woman in yellow. I took her in to dinner, and I remember she loosened my clams for me so I could get them. But the only real person at the table was a girl across in white, a sublimated young woman who was as brilliant as I was stupid, who never by any chance looked directly at me, and who appeared and disappeared across the candles and orchids in a sort of halo of radiance. When the dinner had progressed from salmon to roast, the conversation had done the same thing, from fish to scandal. The yellow gown turned to me. "We have been awfully good, haven't we, Mr. Blakely?" she asked. "Although I am crazy to hear, I have not said wreck once. I'm sure you must feel like the survivor of Waterloo, or something of the sort." "If you want me to tell you about the wreck," I said, glancing across the table, "I'm sorry to be disappointing, but I don't remember anything." "You are fortunate to be able to forget it." It was the first word Miss West had spoken directly to me, and it went to my head. "There's some things I have not forgotten," I said, over the candles. "I recall coming to myself some time after, and that a girl, a beautiful girl—" "Ah!" said the lady in yellow, leaning forward breathlessly. Miss West was staring at me coldly, but, once started, I had to stumble on. "That a girl was trying to rouse me, and that she told me I had been on fire twice already." A shudder went around the table. "But surely that isn't the end of the story," Mrs. Dallas put in aggrievedly. "Why, that's the most tantalizing thing I ever heard." "I'm afraid that's all," I said. "She went her way, and I went mine. If she recalls me at all, she probably thinks of me as a weak-kneed individual who faints like a woman when everything is over." "What did I tell you?" Mrs. Dallas asserted triumphantly. "He fainted, did you hear? When everything was over. He hadn't begun to tell it." I would have given a lot by that time if I had not mentioned the girl, but McKnight took it up and carried it on. "Blakely is a regular geyser," he said. "He never spouts until he reaches the boiling point. And by that same token, although he hasn't said much about the lady of the wreck, I think he is crazy about her. In fact, I am sure of it. He thinks he has locked his secret in the caves of his soul, but I call you to witness that he has it nailed to his face. Look at him." I squirmed miserably and tried to avoid the startled eyes of the girl across the table. I wanted to choke McKnight and murder the rest of the party. "It isn't fair," I said, as coolly as I could. I have my fingers crossed, and you are 5 against 1. And to think that there was a murder on that very train, broke in the lady in yellow. It was a perfect crescendo of horrors, wasn't it? And what became of the murdered man, Mr. Blakely? McKnight had the sense to jump into the conversation and save my reply. They say good Pittsburghers go to Atlantic City when they die, he said. So, we are reasonably certain the gentleman did not go to the seashore. The meal was over at last, and once in the drawing-room it was clear we hung heavy on the hostess's hands. "It is so hard to get people for bridge in September," she wailed. "There is absolutely nobody in town. 6 is a dreadful number." "It's a good poker number," her husband suggested. The matter settled itself, however. I was hopeless, save as a dummy. Miss West said that it was too hot for cards, and went out on a balcony that overlooked the mall. With obvious relief, Mrs. Dallas had the card table brought, and I was face to face with the minute I had dreaded and hoped for a week. Now it had come, it was more difficult than I had anticipated. I did not know if there was a moon, but there was the urban substitute for it, the arc light. It threw the shadow of the balcony railing in long black bars against her white gown, and as it swung, sometimes her face was in the light. I drew a chair close so that I could watch her. "Do you know," I said, when she made no effort at speech, "that you are a much more formidable person tonight in that gown than you were the last time I saw you?" The light swung on her face. She was smiling faintly. "The hat with the green ribbons," she said. "I must take it back. I had almost forgotten." I had not forgotten anything. I pulled myself up short. This was hardly loyalty to Ritchie. His voice came through the window just then, and perhaps I was wrong, but I thought she raised her head to listen. "Look at this hand," he was saying. "Regular pianola. You could play it with your feet." "He's a dear, isn't he?" Alison said unexpectedly. "No matter how depressed and downhearted I am, I always cheer up when I see Ritchie." "He's more than that," I returned warmly. "He's the most honourable fellow I know. If he wasn't so much that way, he would have a career before him. He wanted to put on the doors of our offices, Blakely and McKnight, P.B.H., which is poor but honest." From my comparative poverty to the wealth of the girl beside me was a single mental leap. From that wealth to the grandfather who was responsible for it was another. "I wonder if you know that I had been to Pittsburgh to see your grandfather when I met you," I said. "You?" She was surprised. "Yes. And you remember the alligator bag that I told you was exchanged for the one you cut off my arm?" She nodded expectantly. "Well, in that valise were the forged Andy Bronson notes, and Mr. Gilmore's deposition that they were forged." She was on her feet in an instant. "In that bag?" she cried. "Oh, why didn't you tell me that before? Oh, it's so ridiculous, so hopeless. Why, I could—" She stopped suddenly and sat down again. "I do not know that I am sorry, after all," she said after a pause. "Mr. Bronson was a friend of my father's. I suppose it was a bad thing for you, losing the papers?" "Well, it was not a good thing," I conceded. "While we are on the subject of losing things, do you know that I still have your gold purse?" She did not reply at once. The shadow of a column was over her face, but I guessed that she was staring at me. "You have it?" she almost whispered. "I picked it up in the streetcar," I said, with a cheerfulness I did not feel. "It looks like a very opulent little purse." Why didn't she speak about the necklace? For just a careless word to make me sane again. "You," she repeated, horror-stricken, and then I produced the purse and held it out on my palm. I should have sent it to you before, I suppose, but, as you know, I've been laid up since the wreck. We both saw McKnight at the same moment. He had pulled the curtains aside and was standing, looking out at us. The tableau of give and take was unmistakable. The gold purse, her outstretched hand, my own attitude. It was over in a second. Then he came out and lounged on the balcony railing. "They're mad at me in there," he said airily, "so I came out. I suppose the reason they call it bridge is because so many people get cross over it." The heat broke up the card group soon after, and they all came out for the night breeze. I had no more words alone with Alison. I went back to the incubator for the night. We said almost nothing on the way home. There was a constraint between us for the first time that I could remember. It was too early for bed, And so we smoked in the living room and tried to talk of trivial things. After a time even those failed, and we sat silent. It was McKnight who finally broached the subject. "And so she wasn't at Seal Harbour at all?" "No." "Do you know where she was, Lolly?" "Somewhere near Cresson." "And that was the purse her purse with the broken necklace in it?" "Yes, it was. You understand, don't you, Rich, that, having given her my word, I couldn't tell you." "I understand a lot of things," he said, without bitterness. We sat for some time and smoked. Then Ritchie got up and stretched himself. "I'm off to bed, old man," he said. "Need any help with that game arm of yours?" "No, thanks," I returned. I heard him go into his room and lock the door. It was a bad hour for me. The first shadow between us, and the shadow of a girl at that. Chapter 17